She lay in the wagon like broken cargo, wrists raw from rope, lips cracked from thirst, eyes that had stopped hoping days ago. The note pinned to her dress said only 2 words. Paid, delivered. Ethan Cole hadn't ordered anything but feed and fencing wire. But someone had used his name, his money, his reputation to buy a human being. And when she finally opened her eyes and whispered, "You paid for me. Now do it," he understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a crime. And he was standing in the middle of it. If you want to know how one man's choice to protect a stranger became the most dangerous decision of his life, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat came early to the Arizona territory that summer, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the hardpan and turned the distant mountains into wavering ghosts. By 7 in the morning, the sun had already baked the moisture from the ground, leaving the earth cracked and pale as old bone. Ethan Cole stood on his porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the dust devils spin across the far pasture. He'd been awake since before dawn, as he always was. Sleep had become a stranger to him in the 3 years since Sarah died, visiting only in brief, restless intervals that left him more tired than rested. The ranch stretched out before him in every direction, 800 acres of scrubland and scattered grass that he worked alone. He'd let the hired hands go after the funeral, unable to bear their pitying looks, their careful silences. Now it was just him and the cattle, the horses, and the relentless Arizona sun. He drained the last of his coffee and was turning to go back inside when something caught his eye. Out by the eastern fence line, maybe a quarter-mile distant, something that didn't belong. A dark shape against the pale morning landscape. Ethan squinted, lifting a hand to shade his eyes. A wagon. There was a wagon sitting by his fence, the horse still in traces, its head hanging low. He set down his cup and walked to the corral where his bay gelding stood waiting, already saddled from his earlier rounds. The horse nickered softly as Ethan swung up, and together they made their way across the hard-packed earth toward the fence. As he drew closer, unease began to coil in his stomach. The horse attached to the wagon was a sorry specimen, ribs showing, coat dull with neglect. It stood motionless in the growing heat, too exhausted even to flick away the flies that had begun to gather. The wagon itself was a plain affair, the kind used for hauling supplies. Its canvas cover was torn in places, flapping listlessly in the faint breeze, and there was no driver. Ethan reined in his horse a few yards away and sat still for a moment, listening. Nothing but the creak of the canvas and the buzz of insects. He dismounted slowly, his hand moving instinctively to rest on the grip of the revolver at his hip. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded strange in the morning silence. "Anyone there?" No answer. He approached the wagon from the side, keeping his movement slow and deliberate. The back was covered by a fall of canvas, and he couldn't see what lay within. The smell hit him first, sweat and something darker, something that spoke of human suffering. Ethan pulled back the canvas. For a moment, his mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. A woman lay on the wagon bed, curled on her side like a child seeking comfort and sleep. But this was no peaceful rest. Her wrists were bound with rough rope, the skin beneath torn and bloody. Her dress, once perhaps blue or gray, was so stained with dirt and worse that its original color was impossible to determine. Her hair hung in tangled ropes across her face, and even in unconsciousness, her features were drawn tight with pain. "Jesus," Ethan breathed, the word escaping him before he could stop it. He climbed into the wagon bed, his boots thudding against the wooden planks. Up close, he could see the bruises that darkened her arms, the places where rough hands had gripped and held. She couldn't have been more than 25, maybe younger. It was hard to tell through the mask of suffering that had settled over her features. A piece of paper was pinned to her dress, just above her heart. Ethan pulled it free with trembling fingers. 2 words. Just 2 words written in a crude, blocky hand. Paid, delivered. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. He read the words again, then again, as if somehow their meaning might change. But they remained the same, stark and terrible against the yellowed paper. Paid, delivered, like she was livestock, like she was cargo. Ethan crumpled the note in his fist and turned his attention to the rope binding her wrists. The knots were tight, professional. Someone had done this before, had known exactly how to bind a person so they couldn't escape without tearing themselves apart in the trying. He pulled his knife from his belt and began to saw through the bonds, working carefully to avoid cutting her damaged skin. The woman stirred as the rope fell away. A sound escaped her, not quite a word, more a moan of fear and exhaustion, and her eyes fluttered open. They were gray, those eyes. Gray like winter rain, like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. And they were empty, utterly, completely empty of hope. She looked up at Ethan, and something in her gaze shifted. Not hope. Nothing so kind as that. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. "You paid for me," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. "Now do it." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He rocked back on his heels, the crumpled note still clutched in his hand. "What did you say?" "Do it." Her eyes never left his face. "Whatever you paid for, do it. I won't fight anymore." The emptiness in her voice was worse than screaming would have been. This was a woman who had gone beyond fear, beyond resistance, into some dark place where nothing mattered anymore. A woman who had accepted that she was no longer a person, only a thing to be used. "No," Ethan said, and his own voice came out harder than he intended. "No, I didn't pay for anything. I didn't—" He stopped, struggling to find words that could possibly matter. "I didn't do this to you." Something flickered in those gray eyes. Not belief, she was far beyond believing anything, but perhaps confusion. She had expected cruelty. She had prepared herself for violation. She had not prepared for denial. "The note," she said. "Your name." Ethan looked down at the crumpled paper in his hand, smoothing it out to read it again. But there was nothing there except those two terrible words. No name. No explanation. "There's no name here," he said. "Just—" He couldn't bring himself to repeat the words. The woman closed her eyes. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Ethan feared she had lost consciousness again. Then her lips moved, forming words so faint he had to lean close to hear them. "The man who brought me. He said your name. Said you'd paid. Said I was yours now." Cold fury began to build in Ethan's chest, pushing out the shock and confusion. Someone had done this. Someone had used his name, his reputation, to traffic a human being. And somehow, impossibly, they had arranged for her to be left at his fence like a delivery of goods. "What man?" he asked. "What did he look like?" But she had drifted away again, her breathing shallow and labored. Ethan pressed his fingers to her throat and found her pulse, weak but steady. She was alive. For now. He needed to get her inside. He needed to get her water, food, medical attention. He needed to find out who had done this and why. But first, he needed to get her off this wagon and into his house. Ethan gathered her into his arms as gently as he could manage, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds. Whoever had held her had not been generous with food. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her to his horse, and he felt the heat of fever radiating from her skin. Getting her onto the horse was awkward, but he managed it, settling her across the saddle before swinging up behind her. He kept one arm wrapped around her waist to hold her steady, the other hand on the reins. The bay gelding, sensing something wrong, moved with unusual care, picking its way across the rough ground as smoothly as it could. The ride back to the house took only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. Ethan found himself talking to her as they went, words that probably made no sense but seemed better than silence. "You're going to be all right. I'm taking you somewhere safe. No one's going to hurt you here. You're going to be all right." She didn't respond. He hadn't expected her to. The house was cool and dark after the blazing morning sun. Ethan carried her through the front room. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the window, unused for 3 years, and down the hall to the spare bedroom. He laid her on the bed as gently as he could, then stood back, suddenly uncertain. She needed water. She needed food. She needed her wounds tended. She needed a doctor, probably, though the nearest one was 2 hours' ride away in Prescott. Water first. Ethan fetched a pitcher from the kitchen and returned to find her watching him. Her eyes were open again, tracking his movements with the wariness of a trapped animal. "I'm going to give you some water," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "Can you sit up?" She tried, but her arms trembled with the effort, and she fell back against the pillow. Ethan set down the pitcher and helped her, sliding an arm behind her shoulders to prop her up. She flinched at his touch, but didn't resist. He held the cup to her lips, and she drank, great desperate gulps that spoke of terrible thirst. Water spilled down her chin, soaking into the ruined collar of her dress, but she didn't seem to notice or care. When the cup was empty, she leaned back against his arm, breathing hard. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why are you doing this? If you didn't pay for me?" She stopped, her brow furrowing with the effort of thought. "Why not just leave me? Turn me out?" It was a fair question, a stranger's problem, dumped quite literally on his doorstep. He had every reason to want nothing to do with it, with her. "Because what happened to you is wrong," Ethan said simply. "Because whoever did this used my name to do it. And because—" He hesitated, then finished quietly, "because I'm not the kind of man who leaves a person to suffer when I can help." She studied him for a long moment, those gray eyes searching his face for the lie she expected to find. Whatever she saw there seemed to confuse her more than reassure her. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Neither do I. Not yet. But I'm going to find out who did this to you, and I'm going to make sure it never happens again." It was a foolish promise to make, the kind of thing a man says when he hasn't thought through the consequences. But Ethan meant it. In that moment, looking at this broken woman in his spare bedroom, he meant it with everything he had. "Rest now," he said. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." He helped her lie back down and moved to leave, but her hand shot out, catching his wrist with surprising strength. "My name," she said. "It's Mara. Mara Hale. I'm not nothing. I have a name." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm Ethan Cole, Mara, and you're right. You're not nothing. You never were." He left her then, closing the door softly behind him. In the kitchen, he stood at the sink for a long moment, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles went white. Someone had tried to buy a human being. Someone had used his name to do it. And now Mara Hale lay in his spare bedroom, wounded in body and spirit, looking at him with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. Ethan filled a basin with clean water and gathered bandages from the cabinet where Sarah had kept medical supplies. His hands moved automatically, following patterns learned long ago, while his mind raced through the implications of what he'd found. The wagon hadn't appeared by accident. Someone had driven it to his fence, left it there, and departed. That meant someone knew where he lived, knew his name, knew his habits well enough to predict he'd find it. This wasn't random. This was planned. But who and why? He returned to the spare room with his supplies. Mara had turned on her side, facing the wall, but he could tell by her breathing that she wasn't asleep. "I need to clean your wounds," he said from the doorway. "Your wrists and anywhere else you're hurt. I can send for the doctor in Prescott if you'd prefer, but it'll take most of the day for him to get here." Slowly, she rolled to face him. "No doctor," she said. "No one else." Ethan nodded. He understood that, or thought he did. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. He pulled a chair to the bedside and set down his supplies. "I'm going to need you to tell me if I hurt you. Can you do that?" "Yes." Her wrists were the worst of it. The rope had cut deep, leaving raw wounds that would scar badly if not tended properly. Ethan cleaned them with water and carbolic acid, then wrapped them in clean bandages while Mara lay still, her jaw tight against the pain. "How long?" he asked as he worked. "How long did they have you?" "I don't know. Weeks. Maybe longer." Her voice was flat, detached, as if she were talking about someone else. "I stopped counting." "Where did they take you from?" "Missouri, a town called Helena. I was—" She stopped, and for the first time, emotion cracked through the numbness. "I was answering an advertisement for a schoolteacher position in California." Ethan's hand stilled on the bandage. "A schoolteacher position?" "It was in the paper. Good salary, room and board, respectable family looking for someone to teach their children." A bitter sound escaped her, not quite a laugh. "I should have known. The salary was too good. The whole thing was too good. But I needed the work, and I thought—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "They took you when you arrived for the interview?" "There was no interview, just a wagon waiting at the train station and men who knew my name. By the time I realized what was happening—" She shook her head. "It happened so fast." Ethan tied off the bandage and moved to her other wrist. The rage that had been building in his chest was cold now, focused. Not the hot fury that made men do foolish things, but something harder, something that would wait. "Did they tell you anything? Names, places, where they were taking you?" "They didn't talk to me. Not at first. I was just cargo. Something to be moved." She swallowed hard. "Then, a few days ago, the one in charge, he told me I'd been sold, that I belonged to a rancher in Arizona now, that I should be grateful because he wasn't as rough as some." "Did he say his name?" "No, but the others called him something. Mr. Rook, I think. Or just Rook." Ethan went still. Rook. He knew that name. "You've heard of him," Mara said, watching his face. "Maybe." Ethan forced himself to continue wrapping her wrist, keeping his movement steady. "There's a man who operates out of Prescott, goes by Gideon Rook, deals in—" He stopped himself before he could say the word. "Deals in various trades." "You mean he sells people?" "I mean, I've heard rumors, nothing proven. Rook has protection, influence, the kind of men in his pocket who make sure questions don't get asked." Mara closed her eyes. "So he's untouchable." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Her voice was weary, the weariness of someone who had stopped expecting justice long ago. "Men like him always are." Ethan finished with her wrists and sat back. "How badly are you hurt elsewhere? I can leave you bandages if you'd rather tend to yourself." "Nothing that won't heal." She opened her eyes and met his gaze. "They wanted me intact for the buyer." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and final. Intact. Like she was goods being preserved for market. "I'm going into town," Ethan said, rising from his chair. "I need to find out how this happened. How someone used my name to—" He shook his head. "There's food in the kitchen. Take whatever you need. The doors lock from the inside. You can bar them if that makes you feel safer." "You're just going to leave me here? Would you rather come with me?" She considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "No, not yet." "Then rest. Eat something. I'll be back before dark." He was at the door when her voice stopped him again. "Mr. Cole." "Ethan. Ethan." She said his name like she was testing it, seeing how it felt. "Why are you helping me? Really, I'm a stranger. This isn't your problem." Ethan turned back to face her. In the dim light of the bedroom, with her ruined dress and bandaged wrists and eyes that had seen too much, she looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile. But there was something there too, something under the damage that had survived everything they'd done to her. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said. "I couldn't help her. I couldn't protect her from the thing that took her. I had to sit by her bed and watch and do nothing while she faded away." He paused, the old grief tightening his throat. "I swore to myself then that if I ever had a chance to help someone, really help them, make a difference, I wouldn't waste it. I wouldn't stand by and do nothing." Mara said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I'm sorry about your wife." "Don't be. Just rest. I'll be back." He walked out before she could say anything else. The ride into Prescott took the better part of 2 hours under the blazing afternoon sun. Ethan pushed his horse harder than he should have, but he couldn't seem to slow down. Every minute that passed felt like time wasted, time that Mara's captors could be using to cover their tracks. Prescott was a bustling town by Arizona standards, home to maybe 2,000 souls. It had a main street lined with shops and saloons, a courthouse that served as the seat of territorial law, and all the amenities of civilization, such as it was, this far from the coast. Ethan had come here often in the early days, buying supplies and equipment for the ranch, less often since Sarah died. He tied his horse outside the general store where he usually placed his orders and pushed through the door. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of coffee and leather and 100 other things. Ben Holloway stood behind the counter, his white apron straining across his considerable belly. He looked up as Ethan entered, and his broad face creased into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ethan Cole! Haven't seen you in, 2 months? Beginning to think you'd become a hermit up there on that ranch." "Ben?" Ethan approached the counter, keeping his voice level. "I need to talk to you about my last order." "Last order?" Ben's smile flickered. "That would have been, let me see." He turned to the ledger on the counter, flipping through pages. "Here we are, feed, fencing wire, and—" He stopped. "And what, Ben?" The shopkeeper was staring at the ledger, his face going pale under his tan. That can't be right." "Show me." Ben turned the ledger around. Ethan looked down at the entry, his own name written at the top in the clerk's neat hand. Feed, 50 pounds. Fencing wire, 3 spools. And below that, in different handwriting, blocky and crude, the same hand that had written the note pinned to Mara's dress. Special delivery. Prepaid. To be left at Cole Ranch Fence. "I didn't write that," Ben said quickly. "I swear to you, Ethan, I didn't write that. Someone must have. Who had access to this ledger? Anyone who works here? My clerk? The boys who do deliveries?" Ben trailed off, his face twisting with realization. "That new delivery driver. The one Gideon sent over." "Gideon?" "Gideon Rook. He's got his hand in half the businesses in town. You know that. Said he was doing me a favor, sending over a reliable driver. I didn't think—" Ben stopped again, horror dawning in his eyes. "Ethan, what was the delivery? What did they send to your ranch?" Ethan didn't answer. He was looking at the entry in the ledger, at the price marked beside the special delivery. $300. That was more than he'd spent in a year on ranch supplies. And according to this ledger, it had been charged to his account, money he'd deposited with Ben months ago to cover his usual orders. "Where's the money?" Ethan asked. "What money?" "The $300 for this—" He couldn't bring himself to say it. "For this delivery. Where did it go?" Ben's hands were shaking as he paged through the ledger. "Here. It was withdrawn 3 days ago by—" He swallowed hard. "By someone with your signature." "That's not my signature." "I know. I can see that now. It's close, but—" Ben looked up at Ethan, his face stricken. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I don't know how this happened. The driver, he must have—" "The driver. Where is he now?" "Gone. Took off yesterday without a word. I thought it was strange, but— And where can I find Gideon Rook?" The fear that crossed Ben's face was answer enough. "Ethan, don't. You don't want to tangle with that man. He's got connections, protection. People who cross him have a way of disappearing." "I'm not interested in disappearing." Ethan leaned across the counter, his voice dropping low. "A woman was delivered to my ranch this morning, Ben. A woman, bound and gagged and half dead from whatever they did to her. She was sold like livestock, and my name was used to do it. My money, my reputation. So I'll ask you again, where can I find Gideon Rook?" Ben's face had gone the color of old wax. "The Red Rose," he said quietly. "He has an office above the saloon, but Ethan—" Ethan was already moving toward the door. "Ethan," Ben called after him, "be careful. Rook doesn't play by the same rules as the rest of us, and he always has men around him, always." Ethan paused at the door. "Then I guess I'll have to be persuasive. That's all." The Red Rose was once of Prescott's larger saloons, a 2-story building that had been painted red at some point in its history, though the color had faded to a dusty pink under the Arizona sun. Music spilled from its open doors, a tinny piano playing something vaguely recognizable, along with the smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke. Ethan tied his horse to the post outside and stood for a moment, studying the building. The windows on the second floor were curtained, giving nothing away. 2 men lounged by the front door, watching the street with the practiced casualness of hired muscle. He crossed the street and approached the door. The men shifted, not quite blocking his way, but making their presence known. "Help you?" one of them asked. He was a big man, running to fat, but still solid beneath it. His partner was leaner, with the sharp eyes of a snake. "Here to see Rook," Ethan said. "Mr. Rook doesn't see visitors without an appointment." Tell him Ethan Cole is here. Tell him it's about a delivery." The two men exchanged a look. Something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or warning. "Wait here," the big one said, and disappeared inside. Ethan waited. The lean man watched him with unblinking eyes, one hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. Neither of them spoke. After several minutes, the big man returned. "He'll see you, upstairs, end of the hall." Ethan nodded and stepped past them into the saloon. The interior was what he'd expected, a long bar, scattered tables, a stage at the back where a woman in a worn dress sat at the piano. A few customers looked up as he entered, then returned to their drinks. None of them met his eyes. A staircase at the back led to the second floor. Ethan climbed it slowly, his hand near his gun but not touching it. Not yet. The hallway at the top was narrow and dim, lit by a single window at the far end. 3 doors lined each side, all closed. Ethan walked to the one at the end and knocked. "Come in." He opened the door. The office was larger than he'd expected, well appointed in a way that spoke of money and the desire to display it. Heavy drapes covered the windows, and oil lamps provided a warm glow that was probably meant to be inviting. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat the man Ethan had come to see. Gideon Rook was perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered face of a man who had spent time outdoors and the soft hands of one who no longer needed to. His hair was silver at the temples, swept back from a high forehead, and his eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky, beautiful and utterly cold. "Mr. Cole." Rook didn't rise, but he gestured to one of the chairs before his desk. "Please sit. I understand you have concerns about a recent delivery." Ethan remained standing. "You know why I'm here." "I can guess." Rook folded his hands on the desk, his expression mild. "But I'm afraid you've been misinformed. Whatever you think you know about my operations, a woman was left at my ranch this morning, bound, beaten, half-starved, with a note saying she'd been paid for and delivered." Rook's expression didn't change. "How terrible. And you believe I had something to do with this? Someone used my name to buy her, my money, my signature, forged in the general store ledger, and the driver who did it was sent to Ben Holloway by you. I send drivers to many businesses in this town. It's part of my civic contribution, helping local merchants with their staffing needs." Rook spread his hands, the picture of innocence. "If one of them turned out to be less than honest, I can hardly be held responsible." "Where is he?" "The driver?" "I have no idea. As you say, he appears to have left town." Ethan took a step closer to the desk. "The woman says she was taken in Missouri. Says she was told she'd been sold to a rancher in Arizona. Says the man in charge was called Rook." Something flickered in those cold blue eyes. Not fear. Men like Rook didn't fear men like Ethan. But perhaps calculation. Reassessment. "A traumatized woman says many things," Rook said slowly. "Surely you know that memories can be unreliable, especially after an ordeal. Her memories seemed clear enough to me. And yet, here you are, making accusations without proof." Rook rose from his chair, moving around the desk with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Let me explain something to you, Mr. Cole. I am a businessman. A legitimate businessman with interests throughout this territory. I have friends in the territorial government, friends among the judiciary, friends who would be very concerned to hear that a reclusive rancher was making unfounded accusations against a pillar of the community. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact." Rook stopped a few feet from Ethan, close enough to smell the pomade in his hair. "Whatever you think you know, you can't prove. Whatever that woman told you, her word means nothing against mine. And if you persist in this crusade, you will find that I can make your life very difficult. Your ranch, your reputation, your very existence in this territory, all of it can be swept away." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "And the woman? Mara? What happens to her?" "The woman is property." Rook said it casually, as if discussing a piece of furniture. "Legally purchased, legally transported, legally delivered. If you're concerned about the methods used, I suggest you take it up with the delivery service, but the transaction itself was entirely above board. She's not property, she's a human being. She's cargo that was paid for. What happens to her now is the buyer's concern. Rook's smile was thin and cold. Since you appear to be the buyer of record, I suppose that makes her your concern. Ethan's hand moved toward his gun, but he forced himself to stop. This was what Rook wanted, a confrontation, an excuse to have his men remove the troublesome rancher permanently. "This isn't over," Ethan said. "On the contrary, Mr. Cole, this is very much over." Rook returned to his desk and sat down, picking up a pen as if the conversation had already bored him. "Good day." Ethan stood there for a long moment, rage and frustration warring in his chest. Then he turned and walked out, because staying would accomplish nothing except getting him killed. He made it back to the street without incident, though he felt the eyes of Rook's men on him every step of the way. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, his mind racing. Rook was right about one thing: Ethan had no proof. Nothing that would stand up in court, nothing that would compel the law to act. Mara's word against a wealthy, connected businessman. It would never be enough. But there had to be something, some way to bring Rook down, to free Mara from whatever claim he thought he had on her. The sun was setting by the time Ethan reached his ranch, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. He found Mara in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea growing cold before her. She looked up as he entered, and he could see the question in her eyes. "Rook admits nothing," Ethan said, pulling out a chair across from her. "Says your property, says the transaction was legal." Mara's face didn't change. She had expected this, he realized, had expected nothing else. "So that's it then? I belong to whoever paid for me." "No." Ethan leaned forward, his voice fierce. "You don't belong to anyone. Rook can claim whatever he wants, but I'm not going to let him—" "How?" The word cut through his anger like a blade. "How are you going to stop him? You said it yourself. He has connections, protection. The law won't help. No one will help. This is how things work for women like me." "What do you mean, women like you?" Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was a school teacher in Missouri before. I had my own room, my own salary, my own life. I answered to no one. And then one day I answered an advertisement, and all of it was taken away." She looked down at her bandaged wrists. "I'm not naive, Ethan. I know how the world treats women who have no family, no money, no protection. We're seen as available, as fair game. That's why the advertisement worked. They knew no one would come looking for me. Someone is looking now." "You?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "You're one man, a rancher who lives alone and rarely comes to town. What can you possibly do against a man like Rook?" It was a fair question. Ethan didn't have an answer, but as he sat there in his kitchen watching the last light fade from the windows, something began to take shape in his mind. A plan. Foolish, probably. Dangerous, certainly. But it was something. "There's a way," he said slowly. "One way that Rook can't touch you, can't claim you, can't ever take you away." Mara looked up at him, waiting. "Marriage," Ethan said. "If you were married, you'd be protected by law. Your husband's property maybe, but not Rook's, not cargo to be bought and sold." "You're suggesting I find a husband?" "I'm suggesting—" He stopped, suddenly aware of how this must sound. "I'm not asking you for anything, not expecting anything. But if we were married, on paper at least, Rook couldn't claim you. His forged receipt, his fraudulent transaction, none of it would matter. You'd be free." Mara stared at him. "You barely know me." "I know enough. We've spoken for less than a day. I know that you're brave. I know that you survived something that would have broken most people. I know that you deserve better than to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for Rook's men to come and drag you back." Ethan met her gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to love me, Mara. I'm not asking you to share my bed or my life beyond what's necessary. I'm offering you protection, a shield, nothing more." "And in return?" "Nothing. I want nothing from you except the knowledge that I helped someone who needed it." Mara was silent for a long time. The kitchen had grown dark around them, lit only by the glow of the stove. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this?" Ethan thought of Sarah, of the helplessness he'd felt, watching her slip away, of the promise he'd made to himself in the dark hours after her funeral. "Because it's right," he said simply, "and because I can." Mara looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "I need time to think." "Take whatever time you need. I'll be here." He rose from the table and walked to the door, then paused. "There's a room at the end of the hall. It was my wife's sewing room. It has a lock. You can stay there tonight if you'd feel safer." "Thank you." Ethan nodded and left her there in the darkening kitchen, with the weight of an impossible decision pressing down on her shoulders. He found her in the morning, standing at the window of the sewing room, watching the sun rise over the desert. She turned as he knocked on the open door, and he saw that she had slept, or at least rested, though shadows still marked the skin beneath her eyes. "I've thought about it," she said without preamble. "Your offer." Ethan waited. "I don't trust you," Mara continued. "I can't, not after everything that's happened, but I believe you mean what you say, and I believe that marriage might be the only way to stop Rook from coming after me." "So?" "So yes." She turned to face him fully. "I'll marry you, Ethan Cole, but I want it understood. This is an arrangement, not a romance. I'm not your wife in anything but name." "I understand. And if I ever want to leave, then you leave. No questions, no objections. You're free to go whenever you choose." Mara studied him for a moment, as if searching for the lie in his words. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Then let's get this done, before Rook has a chance to stop us." The minister in Prescott was a nervous young man named Reverend Parker, and he performed the ceremony in his small church with only his wife as witness. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes, words spoken, paper signed, and suddenly Ethan Cole had a wife again. A wife who stood beside him like a stranger. A wife who flinched when he touched her arm to guide her out of the church. A wife whose eyes held no warmth, only a kind of grim relief. It was, Ethan reflected as they rode back to the ranch, not at all how he'd imagined being married again. But then, nothing about this situation was what he'd imagined. Nothing was normal or right or good. A woman had been trafficked and left at his door, a monster walked free in Prescott, and the only thing standing between Mara and a return to captivity was a piece of paper signed in a church. It would have to be enough. For now, it would have to be enough. They reached the ranch as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Mara dismounted without assistance and stood for a moment looking at the house. "This is strange," she said. "Yesterday I was cargo. Today I'm a wife." "Today you're free," Ethan corrected gently. She turned to look at him, and something flickered in her gray eyes. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps the first tentative suggestion of trust. "We'll see," she said. "We'll see if freedom is that easy to come by." And she walked into the house, leaving Ethan standing alone in the yard, wondering what he had set in motion and where it would end. That night, Ethan sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness. Somewhere out there, Rook was planning his next move. Somewhere out there, men who dealt in human flesh were counting their profits and looking for new victims. But not tonight. Tonight, at least, Mara was safe. Protected by law, protected by marriage, protected by the walls of a house that had been empty for too long. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if Rook would accept defeat or come for her anyway. Didn't know if the marriage would hold up to legal challenge or if their desperate gamble would fall apart. But he knew one thing. He had made a choice, and whatever came next, he would see it through. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant, and Ethan Cole kept watch over a woman he barely knew and a future he couldn't predict. Somewhere in the house behind him, Mara Hale slept, perhaps peacefully for the first time in weeks. And in Prescott, Gideon Rook sat in his office above the Red Rose, looking at the marriage certificate his spy had brought him. "So the rancher thinks he's clever," Rook murmured, running a finger along the edge of the paper. "He thinks a piece of paper will protect her." He set the certificate aside and reached for the bell that would summon his men. "Let's show Mr. Cole how wrong he is." 3 days passed in a strange, suspended silence. Mara moved through the house like a ghost, never quite settling anywhere, always listening for sounds that hadn't come yet. She ate when Ethan reminded her to eat. She slept in short, fitful bursts behind the locked door of the sewing room. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then her answers were brief, careful things, words measured out like coins from a miser's purse. Ethan gave her space. He understood, or thought he did, that trust couldn't be demanded or rushed. It had to be earned, slowly, through actions rather than words. So he went about his work on the ranch, mending fences and tending cattle, always making sure she knew where he was and when he'd return. He left food for her in the kitchen. He knocked before entering any room. He kept his distance, his voice low, his movements predictable. On the fourth morning, he found her standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun climb over the eastern hills. She didn't turn when he entered, but she spoke, the first word she'd offered without prompting since their wedding. "I used to watch the sunrise from my classroom window, back in Missouri. The children would arrive just as the light came over the trees, and I'd think, this is good. This is enough. A simple life, but mine." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass. "I was a fool." "You weren't a fool." Ethan moved to the stove, keeping his back to her as he set the coffee to brewing. "You were hopeful. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Hope is what got me into that wagon. Hope is what made me believe the advertisement. Hope is what kept me from fighting back when they first took me, because I kept thinking someone would help, someone would notice, someone would care." Her voice hardened. "No one did." "I did." Mara finally turned to look at him. In the morning light, the bruises on her face had faded to yellow and green, and the rawness around her wrists was beginning to heal. But her eyes, those gray winter rain eyes, still held shadows that no amount of healing would touch. "Why?" she asked. "You keep saying you want to help, that you want to do what's right. But men don't do things for nothing. Everyone wants something." Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table where she could reach it. "My wife was sick for a long time before she died. A wasting sickness, the doctor called it. Something in her lungs that no medicine could touch. I watched her fade away over 18 months, watched her go from the strongest woman I'd ever known to someone who couldn't lift her own head from the pillow." He sat down across from Mara, his hands wrapped around his cup. "The hardest part wasn't the grief, it was the helplessness. Sitting there day after day knowing there was nothing I could do, nothing anyone could do. She'd ask me to read to her, and I'd read until my voice gave out. She'd ask me to hold her hand, and I'd hold it until my fingers went numb. And still she died. Still I lost her." "I'm sorry," Mara said quietly. "So am I. Every day I'm sorry." Ethan looked up at her. "After she passed, I made a promise to myself. If I ever had a chance to help someone, really help them, make a difference when it mattered, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't stand by and do nothing. I'd act." He gestured around the kitchen, at the house, at the land beyond. "You showed up at my fence like something out of a nightmare, hurt, afraid, alone. And I thought, this is it. This is my chance to be something other than helpless." Mara was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "That's a heavy burden to put on one woman. It's not about you. Not really. It's about who I want to be." Ethan stood and moved to the window. "You can leave whenever you want. The marriage gives you protection, but it doesn't give me claim on you. When this is over, if it's ever over, you're free to go wherever you please. Start a new life. Forget any of this happened. And if I want to stay?" The question caught him off guard. He turned to look at her, and something in her expression had shifted. Not warmth exactly, but perhaps the beginning of something less than suspicion. "Then you stay," he said simply, "for as long as you want." Mara picked up the coffee cup and took a small sip. "You're a strange man, Ethan Cole." "So I've been told." They stood there in the morning silence, 2 strangers bound by paper and circumstance, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the air between them felt almost peaceful. It didn't last. The sound of hoofbeats reached them just after noon, multiple horses coming fast from the direction of the road. Ethan grabbed his rifle from beside the door and stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the dust cloud that marked the rider's approach. "Get inside," he told Mara. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I say it's safe." "Who is it?" "I don't know, but I'm not taking chances." She didn't argue. He heard the door close behind him, heard the bolt slide home, and felt a grim satisfaction. Whatever was coming, at least she would be protected by walls and distance. The riders emerged from the dust, 4 men on horseback, approaching at a pace that spoke of purpose rather than urgency. They weren't rushing. They weren't afraid. They rode like men who expected no resistance. Ethan recognized the one in front. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and neck, with the flattened nose of a brawler. One of Rook's men. Ethan had seen him outside the Red Rose. "That's close enough," Ethan called out when they were 20 yards from the porch. He raised his rifle, not quite pointing it at them, but making its presence clear. "State your business." The big man reined in his horse and smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Mr. Cole, Mr. Rook sends his regards. He was hoping you might reconsider your position on a certain matter." "There's nothing to reconsider." "Now see, that's where you're wrong." The man leaned forward in his saddle, his smile widening. "Mr. Rook is a reasonable man. He understands that there's been some confusion about the merchandise that was delivered here. He's willing to offer you a full refund, $300, same as you paid, if you'll just hand over what belongs to him. Nothing here belongs to Rook." "The woman does." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. "She's not a woman to you people. She's a person, a free person, and she's my wife." The big man's smile faltered. "We heard about that little trick. Mr. Rook was not pleased. He sees it as a breach of contract, you might say. You paid for goods, you received goods, and now you're trying to claim those goods were never his to sell." He shook his head in mock sympathy. "That's not how business works, Mr. Cole." "Then take it up with a judge. Mr. Rook would prefer to handle this privately, among gentlemen." "I don't see any gentlemen here, just 4 hired guns trespassing on my land." Ethan raised his rifle fully now, sighting down the barrel at the big man's chest. "I'm going to count to 10. When I reach 10, I start shooting. 1. Now, let's not be hasty. 2. The big man's smile was gone now, replaced by something harder. "You don't want to do this. You're 1 man against 4. The math doesn't work in your favor. 3. Mr. Rook has friends in high places, friends who can make your life very difficult. 4. He could take your ranch, your cattle, everything you have. 5. The big man glanced at his companions, and Ethan saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. They had expected intimidation to work. They hadn't expected resistance. 6. "All right." The big man raised his hands, palms out. "All right. We're leaving, but this isn't over, Cole. Mr. Rook doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." 7. They turned their horses and rode away, not quite fleeing but moving faster than they'd arrived. Ethan kept his rifle raised until they were out of range, then lowered it slowly, his hands trembling with adrenaline. The door opened behind him. "Are they gone?" Mara's voice was steady, but he could hear the fear beneath it. "For now." She came to stand beside him on the porch, watching the dust settle in the rider's wake. "They'll be back." "I know. With more men, with weapons, with whatever it takes." "I know that too." Mara turned to look at him, and there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not suspicion, but a kind of desperate calculation. "We can't stay here. If Rook is determined to take me back, 4 walls and a marriage certificate won't stop him. He'll wait until you're away from the house, or until you're asleep, or until—" "I'm not running." Ethan's voice was firm. "This is my home, my land. If Rook wants a fight, he can have one." "And if you die? What happens to me then?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. Ethan had no answer for it. He'd been so focused on protecting her that he hadn't considered what would happen if he failed. "Then we need to do more than defend," Mara said slowly. "We need to attack." "Attack?" "Rook's power comes from secrecy, from the fact that no one knows what he really does, or no one is willing to say it out loud. But I know. I was there. I saw the other women. The other—" She stopped, her jaw tightening. "If we could expose him, if we could make people see what he really is, it would be your word against his, a traumatized woman against a pillar of the community. Then we find evidence, documents, witnesses, something that proves what he's doing." Mara's eyes were bright now, feverish with purpose. "He can't have covered every track. Someone else must know. Someone else must have seen." Ethan studied her for a long moment. This was not the broken woman who had lain in his wagon 4 days ago. This was someone else, Someone who had found something to fight for beyond mere survival. "It's dangerous," he said. "Everything is dangerous. At least this way we're fighting back instead of waiting to be taken. If we're caught, if we do nothing, we're caught anyway. It's just a matter of time." Mara stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat. "I'm not asking you to fight my battle for me. I'm asking you to help me fight it. There's a difference." Ethan thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made to himself after she died, about the helplessness that had nearly destroyed him, and the chance he'd been given to be something more. "All right," he said, "we fight, but we do it smart. We do it careful. And we do it together." Mara nodded, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like hope flickered in her eyes. They started the next morning before dawn. Ethan knew Prescott well enough to know where to look for information, and more importantly, who might be willing to share it. His first stop was the general store. Ben Holloway was behind the counter as always, but his face went pale when Ethan walked through the door. "Ethan, I heard about the trouble at your place yesterday. Rook's men, asking questions. I need your help, Ben." The shopkeeper glanced around the store, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I don't want any part of this. Rook has too much reach. If he finds out I'm helping you." "He's trafficking women, Ben. Buying and selling human beings like livestock. One of them ended up at my ranch, and there are others. God knows how many others." Ethan leaned across the counter, his voice low and urgent. "You're a good man. I've known you for years. Are you going to stand by and let this happen?" Ben's face twisted with conflicting emotions. Fear, guilt, and something that might have been shame. "What do you want from me?" "The driver who delivered Mara to my ranch. The one Rook sent to work here. You said he took off, but someone must have seen which way he went. Someone must know something." "I don't—" Ben stopped, his eyes dropping to the counter. "There might be someone. A woman who works at the boarding house on Oak Street. Her name's Pearl. She knows things. About Rook's operation." "How do you know that?" "Because her sister was one of them. One of the women he sold." Ben's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She came to town looking for answers about a year ago, started asking questions. And then she stopped asking questions and started just watching, keeping track. I don't know what she's planning, but if anyone can help you, it's her. Pearl, at the boarding house on Oak Street. Don't tell her I sent you. Don't tell anyone I sent you." Ben looked up and Ethan saw real fear in his eyes. "Rook has people everywhere, Ethan. People you'd never suspect. Be careful." Ethan nodded and left without another word. The boarding house was a respectable-looking establishment, 3 stories of whitewashed clapboard with green shutters and a sign that read, "Rooms for ladies and gentlemen." Ethan tied his horse outside and approached the front door, trying to look like a man in need of lodging rather than a man on a mission. The woman who answered his knock was perhaps 40, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She looked him up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. "We're full," she said flatly. "I'm not looking for a room. I'm looking for Pearl." Something flickered in those sharp eyes. "I don't know anyone by that name. A friend of mine suggested I speak with her about a mutual concern, something that happened to someone she cares about." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she stepped back and held the door open. The interior of the boarding house was clean and well kept, smelling of lemon polish and fresh bread. The woman led Ethan through a parlor where several guests looked up with mild curiosity, then down a hallway to a small sitting room at the back of the building. "Wait here," she said, and disappeared through another door. Ethan waited. The sitting room was modestly furnished. A settee, 2 chairs, a small table with a vase of wildflowers. A window looked out onto a back garden where herbs grew in neat rows. It was peaceful, normal. Nothing to suggest that this was the home of someone who kept track of a monster's crimes. The door opened and a woman entered. She was younger than Ethan had expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to hold shadows far deeper than her years should warrant. "You're asking about my sister," she said without preamble. "I'm asking about Gideon Rook." Something shifted in her expression, a hardening, a focusing. Who sent you? I'd rather not say, but I have a reason for asking, a good reason. Everyone thinks their reasons are good. Pearl moved to the window, her back to him. My sister's name was Rose. She was 22 years old, a seamstress. She answered an advertisement for a position in San Francisco, good wages, room and board, respectable establishment. She laughed, and there was no humor in it. The same story they all tell, the same trap they all fall into. What happened to her? She disappeared. One day she was here, writing me letters about her new life, and the next, nothing. I came west to find her. Pearl turned to face him, and Ethan saw the controlled fury that burned behind her eyes. It took me 6 months to learn what had really happened. 6 months of questions and dead ends and doors slammed in my face. And then I found someone who'd seen her being loaded into a wagon, bound and gagged, heading south toward the territories. Rook? His operation, his men, his system. Pearl's voice was flat, mechanical, the voice of someone who had told this story so many times that the emotions had worn smooth. I never found Rose. I don't know if she's alive or dead or where she ended up, but I started keeping track. Names, dates, destinations. Anyone who came through Prescott who matched the pattern. Anyone who asked the right questions. How many? In this past 3 years? At least 40 women. Maybe more. Some from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia. All lured by the same advertisements, the same promises. All disappeared into Rook's network. 40 women. Maybe more. Ethan felt sick. Why haven't you gone to the law? Pearl laughed again, that same humorless sound. The law? The law is in Rook's pocket. The sheriff owes him money. The territorial judge plays cards with him every Saturday night. There is no law for men like Rook. There's only power, and he has more of it than anyone else in this territory. What about evidence? Documents, witnesses. I have plenty of evidence. Shipping manifests with women listed as supplies. Forged contracts that make the sales look legitimate. Testimony from survivors who escaped before they could be sold. Pearl shook her head. None of it matters. Without someone willing to stand up in court and say what they saw, someone who couldn't be dismissed as a liar or a madwoman, Rook will never be touched. I have someone. Pearl went still. What? A woman. She was delivered to my ranch 4 days ago, bound, beaten, left at my fence like cargo. She knows Rook's name. She can describe what happened to her. And she's willing to talk. For the first time, something like hope flickered in Pearl's dark eyes. Who is she? Her name is Mara Hale. She was a school teacher in Missouri. She answered one of those advertisements and ended up... Ethan stopped, the words catching in his throat. She ended up at my door. And now she's my wife. Your wife? It was the only way to protect her. Rook claims she's legally his property, paid for and delivered. But a married woman can't be claimed by anyone but her husband. Pearl was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You married a stranger to protect her from Gideon Rook? I did what was necessary. You have no idea what you've done. Pearl moved closer, her voice dropping low. Rook doesn't give up. He doesn't let go. If he thinks you've taken something that belongs to him, she doesn't belong to him. She doesn't belong to anyone. I know that. You know that. But Rook operates on a different set of rules. In his world, everything has an owner. Everything has a price. Pearl's eyes searched his face. He'll come for her, and he'll destroy anyone who gets in his way. Let him try. Pearl studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. All right, I'll help you. But I need to meet this woman. I need to hear her story. And I need to know that she's willing to stand up and testify, publicly, about what was done to her. She's willing. She's more than willing. She wants to fight. Good. Pearl moved to a cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out a thick folder stuffed with papers. This is everything I've collected over the past 3 years. Names, dates, routes, connections. If your Mara is willing to talk, this might be enough to bring Rook down. But it has to happen fast before he has a chance to retaliate. How fast? Days, maybe less. Pearl's eyes met his, and in them he saw a reflection of his own determination and his own fear. We're going to war, Mr. Cole. I hope you're ready. They rode back to the ranch together, Pearl following on a borrowed horse from the boarding house stable. Mara met them at the door, her eyes wary as she took in the stranger. "This is Pearl," Ethan said. "She's been tracking Rook for 3 years. Her sister was one of his victims." Something shifted in Mara's expression, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be sorry. Be willing to fight." Pearl dismounted and approached the porch, her folder clutched against her chest. "I need to hear your story. Everything you remember. Names, places, faces. The more detail, the better." Mara looked at Ethan, and he saw the question in her eyes. He nodded. "Come inside," Mara said. "This is going to take a while." They sat in the kitchen for hours, the afternoon sun tracking across the floor as Mara talked. She started at the beginning, the advertisement in the Missouri newspaper, the train ride west, the men waiting at the station. Pearl wrote furiously, asking questions, clarifying details, building a picture of Rook's operation piece by piece. Ethan listened in silence, his hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. Some of what Mara described made him sick. Some of it made him angry. All of it confirmed what he'd already suspected. Gideon Rook was a monster, and he had been operating with impunity for far too long. By the time the sun began to set, Pearl had filled half a notebook with notes. She looked exhausted, but grimly satisfied. "This is good," she said. "This is better than good. With your testimony and my evidence, we might actually have a chance." "What's the next step?" Ethan asked. "We need to find a judge who isn't in Rook's pocket, someone with the authority to issue a warrant and the integrity to follow through." Pearl frowned, thinking, "There's a federal judge in Tucson who has a reputation for being incorruptible. If we could get this information to him—" "Tucson is 4 days' ride from here," Ethan said. "More if you're being careful, and Rook's men are watching the roads." "Then we'll have to be very careful." Mara had been quiet for the past hour, listening but not speaking. Now she looked up, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been determination or desperation. "I'll go," she said. Both Ethan and Pearl turned to stare at her. "No?" Ethan said immediately. "Absolutely not. You're the one Rook wants. You can't— I'm the one who needs to testify. The evidence is worthless without a witness, and I'm the only witness who's willing to speak." Mara stood, pushing back from the table. "I won't hide here while other people risk their lives for me. I won't be cargo again, something to be protected and stored and kept safe while the real work happens elsewhere." "Mara, no." Her voice was firm, unyielding. "This is my choice, my fight, and I'm going to see it through." Ethan and Pearl exchanged a look. He saw the same reluctant admiration in her eyes that he felt in his own chest. "All right," Pearl said slowly. "Then we go together, all 3 of us. We'll take the southern route through the backcountry. It's longer, but there's less chance of running into Rook's men." "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning, first light." Pearl gathered her papers and rose from the table. "Get some rest tonight, both of you. We're going to need it." She left to return to the boarding house, promising to return at dawn. Ethan and Mara stood in the kitchen, listening to the sound of her horse fading into the distance. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said finally. "There might be another way." "There isn't. You know there isn't." Mara turned to face him, and in the fading light she looked older than her years. Older, and somehow stronger. "I spent weeks in that wagon, Ethan. Weeks of being treated like an object, like a thing with no will of my own. I swore to myself that if I ever got free, I would never let anyone treat me that way again. I would fight. I would speak. I would matter. You matter." The words came out before Ethan could stop them. "You've mattered since the moment I found you." Mara looked at him for a long moment, and something softened in her expression. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do." She reached out and touched his hand just briefly, just a brush of her fingers against his. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily since he'd found her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." And then she was gone, disappearing down the hallway to the sewing room, leaving Ethan alone with the gathering darkness and the weight of everything that was to come. That night, Ethan sat on the porch again, his rifle across his knees, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, Rook's men were waiting. Somewhere out there, danger was gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. But for the first time since this had all begun, he didn't feel helpless. He had allies now. He had a plan. He had something to fight for, and someone to fight alongside. Tomorrow they would ride south, toward Tucson and a federal judge who might give them justice. Tomorrow they would take the first real step toward bringing down Gideon Rook. But tonight, there was only the quiet of the ranch, the sound of the wind in the scrub grass, and the knowledge that somewhere in the house behind him, a woman named Mara Hale was sleeping peacefully for the second time in weeks. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The first hint of dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Ethan heard it. The sound of a single horse, approaching slowly from the direction of the road. He rose from the porch steps where he'd been sitting, rifle in hand, and peered into the gray half-light. The rider emerged from the darkness like a ghost, a lone figure on a dark horse, moving at a walk. As he drew closer, Ethan could make out details. A man, middle-aged, wearing the clothes of a working cowhand. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual, but something in the pit of Ethan's stomach told him this wasn't a friendly visit. "That's far enough," he called out when the rider was 30 feet away. "State your business." The man reined in his horse and raised his hands, showing they were empty. "I'm just a messenger, Mr. Cole. Nothing more." "Messenger from who?" "From Mr. Rook." The man's voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of someone delivering news he'd rather not deliver. "He wanted me to tell you that he knows about the woman you've been meeting with, the one from the boarding house." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What about her?" "He says you should think carefully about your next move. He says Pearl Morgan has been a thorn in his side for too long, and he's decided to remove her." The messenger paused, and something flickered in his eyes. Pity, perhaps. "He also says that if you try to leave town, you or the woman you married, his men will be waiting. Every road, every trail, every path out of this territory. You're not going anywhere, Mr. Cole." "Is that a threat?" "It's a message. Take it how you will." The messenger lowered his hands and gathered his reins. "I've done what I was paid to do. The rest is up to you." He turned his horse and rode away into the lightening dawn, leaving Ethan standing alone with his rifle and a growing sense of dread. Pearl. Rook knew about Pearl, knew she'd been gathering evidence, knew she'd met with Ethan, knew their plans. He had to warn her. Ethan ran to the corral, saddled his horse with hands that trembled from adrenaline, and was mounted and riding before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He pushed the horse hard, eating up the miles between his ranch and Prescott, his mind racing through the implications of what the messenger had said. Every road watched, every trail blocked. They were trapped. But Pearl was in immediate danger. If Rook had decided to remove her. He reached the boarding house just as the town was waking up. The front door stood open, which was wrong. At this hour, it should have been locked. Ethan dismounted and approached slowly, his hand on his gun. "Hello? Pearl?" No answer. He stepped inside. The parlor was empty, but something was wrong. Furniture overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor, signs of a struggle. He followed the trail of destruction down the hallway to the sitting room where he'd met Pearl the day before. She was there. She was on the floor, slumped against the wall, her dark hair loose and tangled. Her eyes were closed, and for one terrible moment Ethan thought she was dead. Then he saw her chest rise and fall, saw the blood that matted her hair where someone had struck her. Pearl. He knelt beside her, touching her shoulder gently. "Pearl, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found his face. "Cole, they came. Rook's men took the evidence. Don't try to talk. I'm going to get you help." "No." Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Listen, they took the papers, but they didn't find everything. There's more. Hidden, under the floorboards in my room. Maps, names, destinations. Enough to prove what he's doing." "Pearl, get it. Take the woman, your wife, and go. Not south. They're watching the southern routes." She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. "East. Through the mountains. It's harder, but they won't expect it. I can't leave you like this." "You don't have a choice." Pearl's eyes were fierce, burning with the same determination he'd seen in Mara. This is bigger than me. Bigger than any one person. If you don't stop Rook, he'll keep doing this. More women, more victims, more lives destroyed. You have to go. Footsteps in the hallway. Ethan's hand went to his gun. The woman who'd answered the door yesterday appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. I heard... She saw Pearl on the floor and gasped. Oh, my dear Lord! Get the doctor, Ethan said sharply. Now! The woman fled. Ethan turned back to Pearl. I'll get the evidence. I'll stop him. I swear it. I know you will. Pearl's grip on his wrist loosened and her eyes drifted closed. Rose, find her. If you can. Find my sister. Her voice faded to nothing, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Ethan checked her pulse, still there, still steady, and rose to his feet. The floorboards in her room. Under the floorboards. He moved quickly, searching the upstairs bedrooms until he found one that looked lived in. A narrow bed, a washstand, a writing desk covered with papers. The floor was plain wooden planks, worn smooth by years of use. Ethan dropped to his knees and began testing the boards, looking for any that might be loose. In the corner by the bed, one shifted under his fingers. He pried it up with his knife and found a space beneath, and in that space, a leather satchel stuffed with documents. He grabbed the satchel and ran. Mara was waiting on the porch when he returned to the ranch, her face taut with worry. I heard you leave. What happened? Rook attacked Pearl, took her evidence, or thought he did. Ethan dismounted and held up the satchel. There's more. Enough to finish this, but we have to go now, today. Rook's watching all the roads south. Then how? East, through the mountains. It's a harder route, but Pearl said they won't expect it. Mara's jaw set with determination. I can ride. I'm not afraid of hard trails. I know you're not. Ethan met her eyes, and something passed between them. Understanding, trust, the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Pack what you need. We leave in 10 minutes. They rode out of the ranch as the sun climbed toward noon, two figures on horseback heading east toward the distant peaks of the mountains. Behind them, Ethan's home grew smaller and smaller until it vanished over the horizon. Ahead lay danger, uncertainty, and the long fight for justice. But they rode together now, not as strangers, not as captor and captive, but as partners in something larger than either of them. And somewhere in the distance, Gideon Rook was watching, waiting. The game had only just begun. The mountain trail was narrower than Ethan had remembered, barely wide enough for a single horse in places, winding through stands of pine and juniper that blocked the sun and filled the air with their sharp, clean scent. They had been riding for 6 hours, pushing east through terrain that grew steeper and more treacherous with every mile. Mara rode behind him, silent but steady, her hands sure on the reins despite the difficult footing. She hadn't complained once since they'd left the ranch, hadn't asked for rest or water, hadn't shown any sign of the fear that must have been churning beneath her calm exterior. Whatever else Rook's men had done to her, they hadn't broken her spirit. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when Ethan finally called a halt. A small clearing opened before them, sheltered by a ring of boulders and fed by a narrow stream that tumbled down from somewhere higher up the mountain. We'll camp here tonight, he said, dismounting. The horses need rest, and we need to plan our next move. Mara slid down from her saddle, her legs stiff from the long ride. How far to Tucson? Another 3 days, maybe 4, depending on the terrain. Ethan led the horses to the stream and let them drink. Pearl's maps show a pass through the mountains about 20 miles east of here. Once we're through, we can cut south toward the main road. And Rook's men? If Pearl was right, they're watching the southern routes. They won't expect us to come from the east. He paused, looking up at the darkening sky. But we can't count on that. Rook has eyes everywhere. We need to stay alert. Mara moved to the stream and knelt beside it, cupping water in her hands and drinking deeply. When she straightened, her face was thoughtful. Pearl, she said quietly, do you think she'll survive? I don't know. She was hurt badly. Ethan's jaw tightened. But she's strong. Stronger than she looks. She's been fighting this battle for 3 years, alone. Mara shook her head slowly. I've only been part of it for a few days and I already feel like I'm drowning. You're not drowning. You're swimming. Ethan turned to face her, and something in his expression softened. There's a difference. They made camp as the last light faded from the sky, building a small fire in the shelter of the boulders and sharing a meal of dried beef and hardtack from Ethan's saddlebags. The night was cold at this elevation, cold enough that their breath misted in the firelight, and Mara huddled close to the flames with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly. Ethan looked up from the fire, surprised. "Sarah? You mentioned her before. The sickness that took her." Mara's eyes were dark and unreadable in the firelight. "I'd like to know more, if you're willing to tell me." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker, and memories rose up unbidden. Sarah's laugh, the way she'd hummed while she worked in the kitchen, the feeling of her hand in his during those last terrible weeks. "We met in Texas," he said finally. "She was a school teacher there too, like you." A faint smile crossed his face. "I walked into her classroom one day to ask about a job posting I'd seen in town, some rancher looking for hands, and she looked up at me with these blue eyes and said, 'Sir, this is a school for children, not a hiring hall.' And I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there like a fool until she finally laughed and told me to sit down and wait for the lunch hour." Mara smiled softly. "And you waited?" "I waited 3 hours. Missed the hiring altogether. Didn't care." Ethan shook his head. "We were married 6 months later. Moved out here a year after that. She loved the open space, the quiet. Said it felt like the whole world was breathing. She sounds wonderful." "She was." His voice caught, just slightly. "The sickness came out of nowhere. One day she was fine, working in the garden, singing to herself. The next day she couldn't get out of bed, and after that—" He trailed off, the words dying in his throat. "You don't have to—" 18 months. Ethan's voice was flat now, controlled. 18 months of watching her fade away. 18 months of doctors who couldn't help, and medicines that didn't work, and prayers that went unanswered. And at the end, she looked at me and said, 'Don't let this make you hard. Don't let this close you off from the world.' And I promised her I wouldn't." Mara was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Is that why you helped me? Because of what you promised her?" "Partly, but also because—" He stopped, struggling to find the words. "Because you were there. You needed help, and I could give it." He looked up at her, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been pain or hope, or both. "I spent 3 years being helpless. 3 years of not being able to save the person I loved most in the world. When I found you in that wagon, I knew I had a chance to do something different. To be something different. You've already done more than anyone else would have." Mara's voice was soft. "You married a stranger to protect her. You're risking your life to bring down a monster. Most men would have turned away." "Most men haven't lost what I've lost." Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "When you've been through something like that, you start to see things differently. You realize that life is short and choices matter, and the only thing that really counts in the end is whether you stood up for something or just stood by." Mara reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light against the rough fabric of his sleeve. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing up." They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry echoing off the mountain walls. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and ancient, and utterly indifferent to the small human drama playing out beneath them. When Mara finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was engaged once, before all of this." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "His name was Thomas. He was a clerk at a law office in Missouri. We were supposed to be married in the spring." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "But then his family found out about my background, that I was an orphan, raised in a foundling home, and they decided I wasn't suitable. Thomas tried to fight them at first, but in the end—" She shrugged, a small, sad gesture. "In the end, he chose them over me." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He wasn't worth crying over. But something in her voice said otherwise. After that, I threw myself into teaching. It was the only thing I had left. And when I saw that advertisement for the position in California, I thought, this is it. This is my chance to start over, to build a life where no one knows who I am or where I came from. And instead, I ended up in a wagon, being shipped to a stranger like a piece of furniture. Mara laughed, but there was no humor in it. Life has a cruel sense of irony. This isn't the end of your story, Ethan said firmly. This is just a chapter, a dark chapter maybe, but not the end. Mara looked at him, and something shifted in her gray eyes, a softening, a warming. You really believe that, don't you? I do. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, Tell me something, Ethan Cole. What happens when this is over? When Rook is brought to justice and I'm finally free? What then? It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider. The future had seemed so distant, so impossible, that thinking about it felt like tempting fate. But now, sitting by the dying fire with this woman who had somehow become the center of his world, he found that he couldn't avoid it any longer. I don't know, he admitted. I haven't thought that far ahead. Neither have I. Mara pulled her hand back from his arm and wrapped it around her knees. I don't know who I am anymore. The person I was before, the school teacher, the orphan, the almost bride, she feels like a stranger now, like someone I used to know. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe this is a chance to become someone new. Someone new. She turned the words over as if testing their weight. I'm not sure I know how to do that. Neither did I. After Sarah died, I felt like I'd lost not just her, but myself. Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought I was, it all fell apart. Ethan stood and moved to check on the horses, his back to her. It took me a long time to realize that I could rebuild, that the person I became after the loss didn't have to be worse than the person I was before. Just different. Different, Mara repeated softly. I think I could live with different. They slept in shifts that night, one watching while the other rested. Nothing disturbed them except the wind in the trees and the distant calls of nightbirds. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That somewhere out there in the darkness, eyes were following their movements. Dawn came cold and gray, mist rising from the stream and wreathing the boulders in ghostly white. They broke camp quickly, eating a hasty breakfast of cold biscuits and water before mounting up and continuing east. The trail grew steeper as they climbed, switching back and forth up the face of a ridge that seemed to have no top. The horses labored, their breath coming in great plumes of steam, and more than once Ethan had to dismount and lead his mount over particularly treacherous sections. They reached the pass just before noon. It was a narrow gap between two peaks, barely wide enough for the horses to walk abreast, with sheer walls rising on either side. The wind howled through it like a living thing, carrying with it the bite of snow from the higher elevations. Stay close, Ethan called back to Mara. The footing is bad here. She nodded, her face set with determination, and urged her horse forward. They were halfway through the pass when Ethan heard it, the clatter of hooves on stone coming from behind them. He turned in the saddle, his hand going to his gun, and saw them, 3 riders emerging from the mist, moving fast. Mara, ride! She didn't hesitate. She kicked her horse into a gallop, and Ethan followed, the two of them racing through the narrow gap with the thunder of pursuit close behind. The pass opened onto a steep downward slope, loose rock and scrub pine providing treacherous footing. Ethan heard a shot ring out behind them, felt the whistle of the bullet as it passed close to his ear. Keep going, he shouted. Don't stop. Another shot, and this time Mara's horse screamed and stumbled. Ethan watched in horror as the animal went down, throwing Mara from the saddle and sending her tumbling down the rocky slope. He wheeled his horse around and rode back to her, his gun in his hand. The 3 riders were closing fast, their faces hard with purpose. Mara was struggling to her feet, blood on her forehead where she'd struck a rock. Ethan, get behind me. He dismounted and positioned himself between her and the approaching men, his gun leveled at the lead rider. That's far enough, he called out. The riders reined in, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Ethan recognized one of them, the big man who had come to his ranch days ago. Rook's enforcer. Mr. Cole, The big man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You've led us on quite a chase. Turn around and ride away. This doesn't have to end badly. I'm afraid it does. The enforcer's hand rested casually on the grip of his gun. Mr. Rook is very disappointed in you. You took something that belongs to him. You allied yourself with his enemies, and now you're trying to run. The woman doesn't belong to him. She doesn't belong to anyone. That's not how Mr. Rook sees it. The enforcer's smile widened. But I'll tell you what, you hand her over now and we'll let you walk away. No harm done. Just a businessman collecting his property. And if I refuse, then we take her anyway and you don't walk away at all. Ethan felt Mara's hand on his shoulder, her fingers gripping tight. Don't, she whispered. Don't die for me. I'm not planning on dying. He kept his eyes on the enforcer. But I'm not handing you over either. The enforcer sighed as if genuinely disappointed. Have it your way. He moved fast for a big man, faster than Ethan had expected. His gun cleared the holster in a blur of motion, and Ethan fired without thinking, the shot catching the enforcer in the shoulder and spinning him halfway around. The other two riders were drawing their weapons, but Ethan was already moving, shoving Mara behind a boulder and firing again. One of the riders went down, his horse bolting in panic. The third managed to get off a shot that scored across Ethan's ribs like a line of fire, but he kept moving, kept shooting, kept fighting. And then it was over. Two men lay on the ground, wounded or worse. The third, the enforcer, had managed to stay on his horse, his good hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. This isn't finished, he gasped. Rook will send more. He'll send an army. Tell Rook I'm coming for him. Ethan's voice was cold and steady, despite the pain in his side. Tell him that every crime he's committed, every woman he's sold, every life he's destroyed, it's all going to come to light, and when it does, no amount of money or influence will save him. The enforcer laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think you can bring him down? You're just one man. No, Mara said, stepping out from behind the boulder. Her face was bloody, her dress torn, but her voice was strong. He's not alone, and neither am I. She moved to stand beside Ethan, her shoulder touching his. The enforcer looked at them for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he turned his horse and rode away, leaving his fallen companions behind. Ethan watched him go, his gun still raised, until the man disappeared into the mist. Only then did he allow himself to lower his weapon, to feel the full weight of the pain in his side. You're hurt. Mara was beside him instantly, her hands gentle as she pulled back his coat to examine the wound. It's not deep, just a graze. He caught her hand and held it. Are you all right? I've been better. She managed a shaky smile. But I've been worse too. We need to move. More of them will be coming. I know. Ethan looked at the two fallen men. One was clearly dead, his eyes staring sightlessly at the gray sky. The other was groaning, clutching at a wound in his leg. We could question him, Mara said quietly. Find out how many more Rook has sent. Ethan considered this, then shook his head. No time. And whatever he tells us, it won't change what we have to do. He helped Mara onto his horse. Hers was still down, thrashing weakly on the slope, and mounted behind her. The animal was strong, but carrying two riders over this terrain would slow them considerably. We'll have to find another horse, he said, or abandon the mountain route and take our chances on the main road. The main road, Mara said immediately. We've lost too much time. If we don't get to Tucson soon, Rook will find a way to stop us. Ethan nodded slowly. She was right. They had been trying to avoid Rook's men by taking the difficult path, but the difficult path had nearly killed them. Sometimes the direct approach was the only approach. Main road it is, he said. Hold on tight. They rode down the mountain as fast as the single horse could carry them, following the rocky trail until it merged with a wider path that led south toward the desert floor. By late afternoon, they had reached the edge of the mountains, where the terrain opened up into rolling hills dotted with mesquite and saguaro. The main road lay ahead of them, a dusty ribbon of brown cutting through the landscape. And on that road, clearly visible even from this distance, a group of riders was waiting. Ethan reined in the horse and studied the figures. There were perhaps a dozen of them, spread out across the road in a loose line. They weren't moving, just waiting. Rook's men? Mara asked. Maybe, or maybe just travelers. But even as he said it, Ethan knew it wasn't true. The positioning was too deliberate, too strategic. These were men who expected someone to come this way and were prepared to stop them. "We can't go around," Mara said, her voice tight. "The terrain is too open. They'd see us." "I know." "Then what do we do?" Ethan was silent for a long moment, his mind racing through options. Fighting was out of the question. They were outnumbered 6-1, maybe more. Running would only delay the inevitable. And hiding... "There's a town," he said slowly, "about 5 miles west of here, Silver Creek. It's small, but it has a telegraph office." "A telegraph? If we can get a message to Tucson, to the federal judge Pearl mentioned, they could send help. Deputies, marshals, someone with the authority to stop what Rook is doing. And if the telegraph operator is one of Rook's people, then we're no worse off than we are now." Ethan turned the horse west, away from the waiting riders. "It's a risk, but it might be our only chance." They rode hard for Silver Creek, pushing the horse to its limits. The sun was setting by the time they reached the outskirts of the town, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that might have been beautiful under other circumstances. Silver Creek was exactly what Ethan had expected. A handful of buildings clustered around a single main street, a general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple. The telegraph office was at the far end of the street, identified by a faded sign that read Western Union. "Wait here," Ethan told Mara, dismounting in front of the office. "If anything goes wrong, ride. Don't look back." "I'm not leaving you." "Mara," I said, "I'm not leaving you." Her voice was firm, unyielding. "We're in this together, whatever happens." He wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The sun was sinking fast, and Rook's men could arrive at any moment. "All right," he said, "together." They entered the telegraph office side by side. A young man sat behind the counter, his feet propped up on a desk, and a dime novel in his hands. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of Ethan's blood-stained coat and Mara's battered appearance. "Help you folks?" "I need to send a message to Tucson, to Federal Judge Harold Morrison." The young man's feet hit the floor. "Federal Judge? What kind of message?" "The kind that can't wait." Ethan pulled a handful of coins from his pocket and set them on the counter. "This should cover it." The young man looked at the coins, then at Ethan, then at Mara. Something passed across his face, curiosity perhaps, or suspicion. "I need to see some kind of identification," he said slowly. "Protocol, you understand?" "There's no time for protocol." Ethan leaned across the counter, his voice low and urgent. "A man named Gideon Rook is trafficking women across this territory, buying and selling human beings like livestock. I have evidence that can bring him down, but I need federal help to do it." The young man's face went pale. "Rook? Gideon Rook? You know him?" "Everyone knows him. He owns half the businesses between here and Prescott." The young man glanced toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. "Mister, if what you're saying is true, you're in a heap of trouble." "I'm already in trouble. That's why I need to send this message." For a long moment, the young man said nothing. Then slowly, he reached for his telegraph key. "What do you want me to send?" Ethan dictated the message quickly. A summary of Rook's crimes, the evidence in Pearl's satchel, the need for federal intervention. The young man's fingers flew over the key, translating words into clicks that raced down the wire toward Tucson. When it was done, Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "How long before we get a response?" "Depends. Could be an hour, could be tomorrow morning." The young man looked up at them, his expression troubled. "You folks should find somewhere to lie low. If Rook has men in town, is there anywhere safe?" "My aunt runs a boarding house on Oak Street. Tell her Billy sent you. She doesn't ask questions, and she doesn't talk to strangers." Ethan nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." The young man glanced at the door again. "You're not out of this yet, not by a long shot." They found the boarding house without difficulty, a modest 2-story building with a wide porch and curtains drawn tight against the fading light. Billy's aunt was a sturdy woman named Martha, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at them and ushered them inside without a word. You're in trouble, she said as she led them up a narrow staircase. I can see it in your faces. We need a place to stay tonight, Ethan said, just until we hear back from Tucson. You'll stay as long as you need. Martha opened a door at the end of the hall, revealing a small but clean room with a single bed and a washstand. There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry, water for washing in the pitcher. Thank you. Martha paused in the doorway, her eyes moving from Ethan to Mara and back again. Whatever you're running from, I hope you find peace. Both of you. She left, closing the door behind her. Mara sank onto the bed, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. Do you think the message will get through? I don't know. Ethan moved to the window and peered through the curtains at the darkening street below. But we've done everything we can. The rest is out of our hands. I hate that feeling. The waiting, the not knowing. So do I. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Come here. Ethan turned from the window. Mara was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity he hadn't seen before. Your wound needs tending, she said. Take off your coat. He hesitated, then did as she asked. The bullet had torn through the fabric of his shirt, leaving a long gash across his ribs that had crusted over with dried blood. It hurt worse than he'd admitted, a constant throb that sharpened every time he moved. Mara dipped a cloth in the water from the pitcher and began to clean the wound, her touch gentle but efficient. You could have been killed today, because of me. I made my choice. You're not responsible for that. But I feel responsible. She paused, her hand resting against his bare skin. I feel like everything that's happened, everything that's going to happen, is because of me. It's not because of you, it's because of Rook, because of the kind of man he is and the things he's done. Ethan caught her hand, stilling its motion. You're not the villain in this story, Mara. You're the victim, and now you're the witness. A witness who can't seem to stop running. We're not running anymore. We've made our stand. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Mara looked up at him, and something passed between them, something that had been building since the moment he'd found her in that wagon. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something more fragile, more tentative, a beginning. Together, she repeated softly. Together. She finished bandaging his wound in silence, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her breath. When she was done, she didn't move away. She stayed close, her hand on his chest, her eyes searching his face. I don't know what happens next, she said. I don't know if we'll survive this, or if Rook will win, or if any of it will matter in the end. But I want you to know something. What? You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. A tear slid down her cheek, the first he'd seen from her since they'd met. I didn't think I was capable of feeling it anymore. But you proved me wrong. Ethan reached up and brushed the tear away with his thumb. You proved yourself wrong. I just gave you a place to stand. Then thank you for the place to stand. They stayed like that for a long moment, two wounded people holding each other up in the gathering darkness. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust swirling through the empty streets. And somewhere out there, Gideon Rook was watching, waiting, planning. But for now, for this one brief moment, Ethan and Mara had found something like peace. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. The sound of hooves in the street below shattered the silence. Ethan was at the window in an instant, his gun in his hand. A single rider had stopped in front of the telegraph office, his horse lathered with sweat. One of Rook's men, Mara said from behind him, checking to see if we sent a message. Probably. Ethan watched as the rider dismounted and entered the office. Billy will cover for us. He knows what's at stake. And if he doesn't, if he breaks, then we run again. Ethan turned from the window, his face set with determination. But I don't think it will come to that. Billy looked scared, but he also looked angry, like he's been waiting for someone to stand up to Rook. They waited in tense silence as minutes crawled by. Finally, the rider emerged from the telegraph office, mounted his horse, and rode away, heading south, away from the boarding house. Ethan let out a breath. He didn't talk. We're still safe. For now. For now, he agreed. But every hour we stay hidden is another hour for the message to reach Tucson, another hour for help to arrive. Mara nodded, but her eyes were troubled. What if help doesn't come? What if the judge is one of Rook's men, too? Then we find another way. Ethan moved back to the window, watching the empty street. There's always another way. We just have to keep looking until we find it. The night passed slowly, marked by the distant howling of coyotes and the occasional sound of horses on the street below. Neither of them slept, couldn't sleep, not with danger lurking just outside their door. They took turns watching the window, speaking in low voices, planning for possibilities they hoped would never come to pass. Dawn broke gray and cold, mist rising from the ground and wreathing the buildings in ghostly white. Ethan was at the window when he saw it, a rider approaching from the east, moving fast. Mara, wake up. She was beside him in an instant, her eyes fixed on the approaching figure. Is it? I don't know, wait. The rider drew closer, and Ethan saw that it wasn't one of Rook's men. It was Billy, the telegraph operator, his young face flushed with excitement and fear. I got a reply, he called out as he reined in his horse below their window. From Tucson, the judge is sending help. Federal marshals, a whole company of them. They'll be here by tomorrow. Relief flooded through Ethan like a physical force. He turned to Mara, and for the first time since he'd found her in that wagon, he saw her smile. It's happening, she whispered. It's really happening. It's happening. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tight. We just have to survive one more day. But even as he spoke, he heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats coming from the west. Many hoofbeats. Too many. He turned back to the window and felt his heart stop. Gideon Rook was riding into Silver Creek at the head of 20 armed men, and at his side, her face bruised and her hands bound, was Pearl Morgan. Rook reined in his horse in the center of the main street and looked up at the boarding house window, as if he could see through the curtains to the two people hidden behind them. Ethan Cole! His voice rang out across the quiet town. I know you're here. Come out, and let's settle this like civilized men, or stay hidden and watch what happens to everyone who's helped you. Ethan looked at Mara. Mara looked back at him. Together, she said softly. Together, he agreed. And they walked down the stairs to face the monster who had tried to destroy them both. The morning air was cold against Ethan's face as he stepped onto the porch of the boarding house, Mara close behind him. The street stretched before them, empty except for Rook and his men, their horses stamping and snorting in the early chill. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent, as if sensing the danger that had descended on the quiet town. Gideon Rook sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had never known defeat. His silver hair was swept back from his high forehead, and his pale blue eyes gleamed with cold amusement as he watched Ethan emerge from the doorway. Behind him, his men spread out in a loose semicircle, their hands resting on their weapons. And there, at Rook's side, was Pearl. Her face was pale and bruised, her dark hair tangled and matted with blood. Her hands were bound in front of her, and a rope connected her wrist to Rook's saddle horn. But her eyes, those fierce, determined eyes, were very much alive. Mr. Cole, Rook's voice carried easily across the still morning air. I was beginning to think you'd make me wait all day. Let her go, Rook. Ethan's voice was steady, but his hand hovered near his gun. She's got nothing to do with this. On the contrary, Miss Morgan has everything to do with this. She's been a thorn in my side for 3 years, collecting evidence, asking questions, turning over rocks I'd rather keep undisturbed. Rook's smile widened. Did you really think I didn't know? Did you think I'd let her operate in my territory without keeping an eye on her? If you knew, why didn't you stop her? Because she was useful. A lone woman, tilting at windmills, never quite finding enough proof to cause real trouble. She made me look untouchable. Rook's smile faded. But then you came along, Mr. Cole. You and your misguided sense of chivalry. You took my property, allied yourself with my enemies, and now you're trying to bring in federal law. That I cannot allow. She's not your property. Ethan took a step forward, his jaw tight. Mara is a free woman, a married woman. Your claim on her means nothing. A marriage of convenience entered into under false pretenses. I have lawyers who can tear that apart in a matter of hours. Rook dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. But let's not waste time on legal technicalities. I'm here to make you an offer. I'm not interested in your offers. You should be, because the alternative is unpleasant for everyone. Rook walked forward, stopping a few feet from the porch steps. Up close, Ethan could see the lines around his eyes, the faint yellowing of his teeth, the carefully controlled cruelty that lurked beneath his polished exterior. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to hand over the evidence Miss Morgan collected. You're going to give me the woman you call your wife, and you're going to forget any of this ever happened. And if I refuse, then I kill Miss Morgan. Then I burn this town to the ground. Then I hunt you down and do things that will make you beg for death. Rook's voice never rose above a conversational tone. I'm not a man who makes idle threats, Mr. Cole. Everything I say, I mean. Everything I promise, I deliver. Behind Ethan, Mara stepped forward to stand beside him. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. You're afraid. Rook's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Excuse me? You're afraid. That's why you're here with 20 men and threats and bound prisoners, because you know what's coming. You know that federal marshals are on their way, and when they arrive, all your money and influence won't mean a thing. Mara's chin lifted. You're not here to negotiate. You're here because you're desperate. The silence that followed was deafening. Rook stared at Mara, his pale eyes glittering with something that might have been rage or admiration or both. You've got spirit, he said finally. I'll give you that. Most women in your position would be weeping and pleading, but you... He shook his head slowly. You're something different. I'm someone who's not afraid of you anymore. Perhaps you should be. Rook turned back to Ethan. Last chance, Mr. Cole. Give me what I want, or watch everyone you care about die. Ethan looked at Pearl, bound and bruised but unbroken. He looked at Mara, standing tall beside him despite everything she'd endured. He looked at the men surrounding them, armed and ready for violence. And he made his choice. No. The word hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. Rook's face went very still. You understand what you're saying? I understand perfectly. You want me to surrender. You want me to give up the woman I married and the evidence that can bring you down. You want me to let you keep doing what you've been doing, buying and selling human beings like cattle. Ethan's voice rose, carrying across the street to where the townspeople were beginning to gather at windows and doorways. I'm saying no, not today, not ever. Then you've chosen death. Maybe, but you've chosen something worse. Ethan stepped to the edge of the porch, his eyes locked on Rook's. You've chosen to do this in public, in front of witnesses, in a town where people will remember what happened here today. Even if you kill us all, you can't kill the truth. Word will spread, stories will be told, and sooner or later, someone will come asking questions you can't answer. Rook's jaw tightened. You're bluffing. Am I? Ethan gestured at the windows where faces had appeared, at the shopkeepers and farmers and ordinary citizens watching the confrontation unfold. Look around you. These people have been living in fear of you for years. They've looked the other way while you built your empire on human suffering. But now they're watching. Now they're seeing who you really are. They see a businessman protecting his interests. They see a monster threatening to burn their town. Ethan's voice dropped, but every word was clear. You can't win this, Rook, not anymore. The message has been sent. The marshals are coming, and even if you kill every single person here today, it won't change what's about to happen. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the street was palpable, thick enough to taste. Rook's men shifted uneasily on their horses, their eyes darting between their boss and the growing crowd of witnesses. Then Pearl spoke, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He's right, you know. All eyes turned to her. She was still bound, still bleeding, but she stood as straight as her injuries would allow. I've spent 3 years gathering evidence against you, she said. Names, dates, shipping manifests, forged contracts, testimony from survivors who escaped your network. I thought I was the only one who knew, but I was wrong. She turned to look at the crowd, at the faces in the windows. They know, they've always known. They just didn't think anyone would ever have the courage to stand up and say it out loud. Shut up, Rook snarled. My sister was one of your victims. Rose Morgan, 22 years old, a seamstress from Missouri. Pearl's voice was steady, but tears were streaming down her face. You took her from her home. You shipped her across the country like cargo. You sold her to the highest bidder. She turned back to Rook, and her eyes were blazing. I don't know where she is now. I don't know if she's alive or dead. But I know what you did to her. And I know that as long as I draw breath, I will never stop fighting to bring you down. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Rook's men seemed frozen, their faces slack with shock or uncertainty. And then, something remarkable happened. A man stepped out of the general store. He was middle-aged, heavy-set, with the calloused hands of a laborer. He walked across the street and stopped beside Ethan, facing Rook. Name's Henderson, he said quietly. My daughter disappeared 2 years ago. Answered an advertisement for a housekeeping position in California. He paused, his voice catching. I never saw her again. Another figure emerged from the crowd. A woman this time, older, with gray hair and a face lined by grief. My niece, she said. 3 years ago. They said she ran off with a traveling salesman. I never believed it. One by one, they came forward. Men and women, young and old, each with a story of loss and suspicion and carefully suppressed doubt. They formed a loose line behind Ethan and Mara, facing Rook and his men, their presence a silent testament to the scope of his crimes. You see, Ethan said softly, the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deep you bury it. Rook's face had gone pale beneath his tan. His eyes darted from the growing crowd to his men, who were looking increasingly uncertain about the situation. This doesn't change anything, he said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. I have the law on my side. I have documents, contracts, proof that every transaction was legal and above board. Forged documents, Pearl said. Fraudulent contracts. I have copies of them all, and I know what they really say. You have nothing. Everything you collected is gone, destroyed. Not everything. Pearl smiled, and for the first time there was something like triumph in her expression. The documents you took from my boarding house? Those were copies, decoys. The originals are somewhere you'll never find them. Rook's composure finally cracked. You're lying. Am I? I've been doing this for 3 years, Mr. Rook. Did you really think I'd keep all my evidence in one place? Pearl shook her head slowly. The originals are already on their way to Tucson, by courier. A different route than the one you were watching. By the time you figure out which one, it'll be too late. For a long moment, Rook simply stared at her. Then his hand moved toward his gun. Don't. Ethan's voice was sharp. You draw that weapon and it's over. 20 witnesses. 20 people who will tell the marshals exactly what happened here today. Witnesses can be silenced. All of them? Every person in this town? Every traveler who passes through and hears the story? Ethan shook his head. You're beaten, Rook. You just don't know it yet. The standoff stretched on, seconds ticking by like hours. Rook's men were openly nervous now, their horses shifting and stamping, their hands uncertain on their weapons. The crowd behind Ethan continued to grow, more and more townspeople emerging from their homes and businesses to stand witness to what was happening. And then, in the distance, Ethan heard it, the sound of hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Coming fast from the east. Rook heard it too. His head snapped around, his eyes scanning the horizon. They appeared over the rise like an answer to a prayer, a column of riders in dark coats, badges glinting on their chests. Federal marshals, at least a dozen of them, riding hard toward Silver Creek. The message got through, Mara breathed beside him. Billy's message got through. The marshals thundered into town, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they surrounded Rook and his men. At their head rode a man with iron-gray hair and a face like weathered granite, his eyes taking in the scene with quick professional assessment. I'm Deputy Marshal Thomas Harker, he announced, his voice carrying over the confusion. We received a telegraph about a situation involving trafficking and unlawful detention. His gaze settled on Rook. I assume you're Gideon Rook? I am. Rook had recovered some of his composure, his spine straightening. And I demand to know the meaning of this intrusion. I'm a legitimate businessman, and these people have been spreading lies about me." "That's so." Harker looked around at the crowd, at Pearl with her bound hands and bloody face, at Mara standing tall beside Ethan. "Seems to me like there's a story here that needs telling. Why don't we all take a ride into town and sort this out proper-like?" "I have nothing to say. I want my lawyer." "You'll get your lawyer, but first we're going to have a conversation." Harker nodded to his men. "Take Mr. Rook and his associates into custody, and someone get that woman untied." What happened next was chaos of a sort. Men dismounting, weapons being collected, voices raised in anger and protest. Rook's men offered no resistance. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and whatever loyalty they'd had to their boss evaporated in the face of federal authority. Within minutes, they were lined up against the wall of the general store, hands bound behind their backs. Rook himself was escorted none too gently from his horse, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. As the marshals led him past Ethan, he stopped. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I have friends, powerful friends. You think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but I've also given you something to think about during the long nights ahead. Every woman you sold, every life you destroyed, every family you tore apart." He leaned closer. "They're going to haunt you, Rook. For the rest of your miserable life, they're going to haunt you." Rook's pale eyes glittered with hatred, but he said nothing more. The marshals pulled him away, and Ethan watched him go with a feeling that was part satisfaction, part exhaustion, and part something he couldn't quite name. Pearl was at his side a moment later, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had cut into them. "You did it," she said softly. "You actually did it." "We did it. All of us." Ethan looked at Mara, who was standing a few feet away, her gray eyes fixed on the retreating figure of Gideon Rook. "It's not over yet. There'll be trials, testimony, lawyers trying to get him off, but it's a start. It's more than a start. It's a crack in the wall. And once a wall starts cracking, it doesn't stop." Pearl smiled, and despite the blood and bruises, she looked almost beautiful. Rose would be proud. Wherever she is, she'd be proud. "We'll find her," Ethan said. "We'll find all of them, every woman Rook ever took. We'll bring them home." "That's a big promise." "It's the only promise that matters." Deputy Marshal Harker approached them, his weathered face serious. "I'm going to need statements from all of you. Everything you know about Rook's operation, names, dates, locations. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." "You'll have everything," Mara said, stepping forward. "I'll testify. I'll tell them what happened to me, what I saw, what I heard. Whatever it takes to make sure he never hurts anyone again." Harker studied her for a moment, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. "You're a brave woman, Mrs. Cole." "I'm a survivor. There's a difference." The marshal nodded slowly. "Maybe there is, at that." The hours that followed were a blur of activity. The townspeople, emboldened by Rook's capture, came forward in droves to share their stories. Daughters who had disappeared, sisters who had never returned, wives who had vanished without a trace. Pearl organized them, taking notes, cross-referencing names and dates with her own records. The picture that emerged was devastating. Dozens of victims, possibly hundreds, stretching back nearly a decade. Ethan watched it all from the porch of the boarding house, exhaustion settling into his bones like lead. The wound in his side throbbed with every breath, and his eyes burned from lack of sleep. But beneath the weariness, something else was growing, something that felt suspiciously like peace. Mara found him there as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street. "You should rest," she said, settling onto the step beside him. "I will, soon." He turned to look at her, taking in the cuts on her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she held herself as if expecting another blow at any moment. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know. Better than I expected, I think." She was quiet for a moment. "When Rook rode into town this morning, I thought it was over. I thought everything we'd done, everything we'd risked, was for nothing. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't." Mara turned to face him, and something in her expression had changed. The wariness was still there, but it was tempered now by something softer, something like trust. "Thank you, Ethan, for not giving up, for standing beside me when you could have walked away." I couldn't walk away. Not from this. Not from you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mara looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly. What happens now? She asked softly. Now we testify. We help Harker build his case. We make sure Rook faces justice for everything he's done. Ethan paused, and after that, I don't know. I haven't thought that far ahead. Neither have I. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, the marriage. It was supposed to be temporary, just a shield to protect me from Rook's claims. I remember. But now, she stopped, struggling to find the right words. Everything's changed now. Everything's different. Does it have to be? Mara looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Ethan took a deep breath. What he was about to say might ruin everything, or it might be the beginning of something new. I know we got married for practical reasons. I know it was supposed to be an arrangement, nothing more. But somewhere along the way, he stopped, started again. Somewhere along the way, it became more than that. At least for me. Ethan, I'm not saying you have to feel the same way. I'm not asking for anything, but I want you to know that when this is over, when Rook is locked away and the trials are finished, I'm not going to hold you to something you never wanted. If you want to leave to start over somewhere else, I'll help you do that. I'll give you money, a horse, whatever you need. But if you want to stay, he met her eyes. If you want to stay, there'll be a place for you. Always. Mara stared at him for a long moment, her gray eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. When I was in that wagon, she said quietly, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never be free again, never make my own choices, never be anything more than property. She squeezed his fingers. You gave me my life back. You gave me hope when I had none. And somewhere along the way, she smiled, a small trembling thing. Somewhere along the way, it became more than gratitude. At least for me. Ethan's heart seemed to stop. Mara, I'm not saying I love you. It's too soon for that, and we both know it. But I'm saying I want to find out. I want to see who we could be together without Rook's shadow hanging over us. She lifted his hand and pressed it to her cheek. If you'll have me. There's nothing in this world I want more. They sat there as the sun sank below the horizon, two damaged people holding on to each other against the gathering darkness. Around them, the town buzzed with activity, marshals taking statements, townspeople sharing stories, the wheels of justice finally beginning to turn. But for this one moment, none of it mattered. They had survived. They had fought back. They had won. And now, finally, they could begin to heal. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of depositions and testimonies. Mara spoke to Marshal Harker for hours, recounting every detail of her capture and transport, the men who had taken her, the routes they had traveled, the glimpses she had caught of other victims along the way. Pearl provided her extensive documentation, years of painstaking research finally being put to use, and Ethan filled in the gaps, describing how Mara had arrived at his ranch, the confrontations with Rook's men, the desperate flight through the mountains. The evidence was overwhelming. Rook's lawyers tried every trick they knew, claiming the documents were forgeries, that the witnesses were unreliable, that their client was the victim of a conspiracy. But with each passing day, more survivors came forward, women who had escaped from Rook's network, family members who had finally found the courage to speak. Law enforcement officials from other territories who had suspected the truth for years but had never had the evidence to act. On the fifth day, Marshal Harker came to see Ethan and Mara at the boarding house. It's done, he said, settling into a chair with the air of a man who had finally set down a heavy burden. The territorial judge has ordered Rook to stand trial. He's being transferred to Tucson tomorrow, where he'll face federal charges. Trafficking, kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy. The list goes on for pages. Will he be convicted? Mara asked. I can't guarantee anything, but with the evidence we've gathered, the witnesses who've come forward, the scope of what he's done. Harker shook his head slowly. I've never seen a case this strong. If he walks free, there's no justice left in this territory. And his men, his operation? Being dismantled as we speak, We've arrested 16 of his associates so far, and we're tracing his network through the documents Miss Morgan provided. Parker paused. We've also found records of some of his transactions, names and destinations. We're doing everything we can to locate the women who were taken. Pearl looked up sharply. You found names? Over 100 of them, going back almost 10 years. Parker's weathered face was grim. I won't lie to you. Many of them may never be found. Rook sold them to buyers across the country, some as far away as the East Coast. But we're trying. We'll keep trying until we've exhausted every lead. Rose Morgan. Pearl's voice was barely above a whisper. My sister. Is her name on the list? Parker was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. We found a record of a sale 3 years ago. A woman matching your sister's description, shipped to a buyer in San Francisco. He handed her the paper. I've already sent a wire to the authorities there. They're looking for her. Pearl took the paper with trembling hands. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. 3 years, she said softly. 3 years, and I finally have a lead. Thank you, Marshal. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank the people who had the courage to stand up and fight. Parker looked at Ethan and Mara. What you did took more bravery than most people have in a lifetime. You should be proud. We did what we had to do, Ethan said. Anyone would have done the same. No. Parker rose to his feet. They wouldn't. Most people would have looked the other way. Most people would have told themselves it wasn't their problem. He extended his hand and Ethan shook it. Whatever happens next, know that you made a difference, a real difference. After the marshal left, Ethan, Mara, and Pearl sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of everything that had happened, the fear, the danger, the desperate fight for survival, seemed to lift slightly, replaced by something lighter. Something that felt almost like hope. What will you do now? Mara asked Pearl. Go to San Francisco, find my sister. Pearl's dark eyes were bright with determination. And after that, I don't know, maybe keep fighting. There are other men like Rook out there, other women who need help. Maybe it's time someone started looking for them. You'll make a formidable enemy for them, Ethan said. I intend to. Pearl stood, gathering her papers. But first, I have a train to catch. The first westbound leaves tomorrow morning. She paused at the door, looking back at them. Thank you, both of you. I couldn't have done this without you. You could have, Mara said softly. You were doing it long before we came along. Maybe, but it's nice not to fight alone. Pearl smiled, and for a moment she looked almost peaceful. Take care of each other. You deserve happiness. And then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan and Mara sat in the quiet room, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. Outside, the sun was setting over Silver Creek, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. So, Mara said finally, what do we do now? Ethan reached over and took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. Now we go home, he said simply, and we start living. The road back to the ranch felt longer than Ethan remembered, each mile stretching out beneath the autumn sun like a ribbon of dust and memory. They rode side by side now, 2 horses instead of 1, moving at an easy pace that spoke of weariness and relief in equal measure. The Arizona landscape spread around them in shades of gold and brown, the mountains rising in the distance like sentinels watching over their return. Mara was quiet for most of the journey, her gray eyes fixed on the horizon, her thoughts somewhere far away. Ethan didn't push her to talk. After everything they'd been through, silence felt like a gift. The absence of danger, the space to breathe, the simple peace of existing without fear. It was late afternoon when they crested the final ridge and saw the ranch spread out below them. The house stood just as Ethan had left it, its weathered boards glowing amber in the slanting light. The barn, the corral, the windmill turning lazily in the breeze, everything was exactly as it had been, unchanged by the chaos that had erupted in their absence. But as they drew closer, Mara reined in her horse and sat very still, staring at the house with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. What is it? He asked softly. This is where it started. Her voice was barely above a whisper. This is where they left me. At that fence, right there. She pointed to the eastern boundary where the post stood in a straight line against the sky. I was so sure I was going to die here, so sure that whoever had paid for me would use me up and throw me away like garbage. Ethan moved his horse closer to hers. And now? Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to look at him, and something had shifted in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. A softness, a warmth. Now I think this might be the first place I've ever truly felt safe. They rode down to the house together, dismounting in the yard and leading the horses to the water trough. The animals drank deeply, their sides heaving from the long journey, while Ethan and Mara stood in the fading light and let the silence settle around them. "It needs work," Ethan said, looking at the house with fresh eyes. "The porch is sagging, and the roof could use patching. I've let things go these past few years. We can fix it." Mara's use of the word "we" wasn't lost on either of them. Together. They went inside, and Ethan built a fire while Mara explored the rooms she'd barely seen during her first days here. She moved through the house like someone learning the shape of a new language, running her fingers along shelves and windowsills, pausing to examine the small details that revealed who had lived here before. In the bedroom that had belonged to Sarah, she found a photograph on the dresser. A young couple standing before a church. The woman in white, the man in a dark suit. Both of them smiling as if they'd just discovered the secret to happiness. "Your wife?" she asked when Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Our wedding day, 12 years ago." He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking at the photograph with eyes that held more sadness than pain. "She was so young. We both were. We thought we had forever." Mara set the photograph down gently. "Do you want me to move it? Put it away somewhere?" "No." Ethan shook his head slowly. "She was part of my life, part of who I am. I don't want to pretend she never existed." He turned to face Mara. "But she's not coming back. And you're here. You're real. And I'd like to think she'd be happy to know that I found someone who could make me feel alive again." "Do I? Make you feel alive?" "More than I thought possible." He reached out and took her hand, holding it loosely. "I know it's soon. I know we've only known each other for a matter of weeks. But when you've been through what we've been through, time moves differently. Days feel like months. Moments feel like years." "I know what you mean." Mara squeezed his fingers. "When I was in that wagon, I lost track of time completely. It could have been days or weeks or months. I had no way of telling. And now, standing here with you, it feels like I've known you my whole life. Is that a good thing?" She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "It's the best thing." They ate dinner in the kitchen that night, a simple meal of beans and cornbread that Ethan had thrown together from the supplies left in the pantry. It wasn't elegant, but it was warm and filling, and they ate in companionable silence, content just to be together in the flickering lamplight. After dinner, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, one by one, until the sky was blazing with them. The night was cool but not cold, and the breeze carried the scent of sage and dust and something sweeter underneath, the smell of the desert blooming in the aftermath of recent rain. "I've been thinking," Mara said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" "About what comes next. About who I want to be now that I'm free to choose." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "Before all this happened, I was a school teacher. It was all I knew, all I'd ever wanted to be. I thought I'd spend my whole life in a classroom, shaping young minds, making a difference in small ways. And now? Now I don't know." She shook her head slowly. "I'm not the same person I was before. That woman, the one who answered the advertisement, who believed the world was basically good, she's gone. I can't go back to being her." "You don't have to." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You can be whoever you want to be. That's what freedom means." "I know, it's just—" She trailed off, struggling to find the words. "I keep thinking about Pearl, about the 3 years she spent fighting Rook alone, with no one to help her. About how many women are still out there, trapped in situations like I was, waiting for someone to save them." "You want to help them?" It wasn't a question, and Mara didn't answer it like one. She just nodded, her eyes still fixed on the stars. The marshal said they found over 100 names in Rook's records, 100 women sold like cattle scattered across the country. Most of them will never be found, but some of them might be. If someone went looking. She turned to face him. I could be that someone, Ethan. I could use what happened to me to help others, to make sure no one else has to go through what I went through. It would be dangerous. Rook wasn't the only one doing this. There are others out there, maybe worse. I know, but I survived once. I can survive again. Her jaw set with determination. And this time, I won't be alone. Ethan studied her face in the starlight, seeing the strength that had always been there, the fire that Rook's men had tried and failed to extinguish. She was right. She wasn't the same person she'd been before. She was something more, something stronger. If that's what you want to do, he said slowly, then I'll help you, however I can. You mean that? I mean everything I say to you, Mara. Always. She reached out and took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Then let's do it together. Let's build something here. Not just a home, but a refuge. A place where women like me can come when they escape. A place where they can heal and learn and become whoever they want to be. A sanctuary. Yes. Mara's eyes were bright with purpose. A sanctuary. Right here, on this land where I almost died. We can turn it into something good. Something that matters. Ethan looked out at the dark expanse of his ranch, seeing it suddenly not as a place of isolation and grief, but as something new, something full of possibility. It won't be easy, he said. We'll need help, money, people who believe in what we're trying to do. We'll find them. Pearl has contacts, other women who've been fighting this battle in their own ways, and the marshals might help if we ask. They know better than anyone how big this problem is. And Rook? His trial? I'll testify. As many times as it takes. Mara's voice was steady. I won't hide from what happened to me. I'll use it. I'll make sure the world knows exactly what men like him are capable of. They sat in silence for a while longer, their hands still clasped, their minds turning over the enormity of what they were planning. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. But as Ethan looked at the woman beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope that had sustained him through Sarah's illness, but something deeper, something solid. We should get some sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. What's happening tomorrow? Ethan smiled. The first day of our new life, whatever that looks like. They went inside, and for the first time, Mara didn't retreat to the sewing room at the end of the hall. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom, Ethan's bedroom, the one he'd shared with Sarah, and looked at him with a question in her eyes. I'm not ready for... She paused, color rising in her cheeks. I mean, after everything that happened, I'm not sure when I'll be ready to... I know. Ethan kept his voice gentle. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not expecting anything. But if you want company, just company, there's room enough for both of us. Mara studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or hidden intent. Finding none, she nodded slowly. Company would be nice? They lay down together, fully clothed, on opposite sides of the bed. The space between them was wide enough to feel safe, narrow enough to feel connected. Outside, the wind whispered through the scrub grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song. Ethan? Yes? Thank you for everything. You don't have to thank me. I know, but I want to. She was quiet for a moment. When I woke up in that wagon and saw you standing there, I thought you were just another monster. Another man who wanted to use me and throw me away. I've never been so glad to be wrong about someone in my life. I'm glad you were wrong too. Ethan stared at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of her presence beside him. You know, when I found you, I thought I was saving you, but I think maybe you saved me too. From what? From myself. From spending the rest of my life alone, grieving for something I couldn't change. He turned his head to look at her. You reminded me that there's still good in the world, still things worth fighting for. Mara reached across the space between them and found his hand in the darkness. Then I guess we saved each other. I guess we did. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, hearts slowly beginning to heal. The weeks that followed were filled with work and planning and the gradual building of something new. Ethan rode into Prescott to meet with Ben Holloway, who had heard about what happened in Silver Creek and was eager to make amends for his unwitting role in Mara's delivery. He offered to help spread the word about the sanctuary, to connect them with other merchants and ranchers who might be willing to contribute. Mara wrote letters to Pearl in San Francisco, to Marshall Harker in Tucson, to anyone she could think of who might have information about missing women or resources to help locate them. The responses came slowly at first, then faster, as word of what they were doing spread through the territory. Pearl's reply arrived in early November, 3 pages of cramped handwriting that Mara read aloud to Ethan over dinner. She found her sister, Mara said, her voice breaking. Rose was working as a servant in a wealthy household in San Francisco. The family had no idea where she'd really come from. They thought she was just another immigrant looking for work. Pearl walked into that house and Rose didn't recognize her at first. 3 years of not knowing if her sister was alive or dead, and when they finally saw each other, she couldn't continue. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. That's wonderful news. It is. It really is. Mara wiped her eyes with her free hand. Pearl says Rose is healing. Slowly, but she's healing. They're planning to stay in San Francisco for now, but Pearl wants to come visit us in the spring. She wants to see what we're building here. She'll be welcome. Anyone who helped bring Rook down will always be welcome. The trial began in December, just as the first snows were falling on the Arizona mountains. Ethan and Mara traveled to Tucson together, staying in a modest hotel near the courthouse where Gideon Rook would finally face justice. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial. People came from all over the territory to watch the man who had operated in their midst for so long finally answer for his crimes. Newspaper reporters sat in the gallery, scribbling notes that would be telegraphed across the country. And in the front row, the families of Rook's victims gathered to bear witness, their faces a mixture of grief and hope. Mara testified on the 3rd day. She walked to the witness stand with her head held high, her gray eyes steady, and she told her story, all of it, leaving nothing out. The advertisement, the train ride, the men at the station, the wagon, the rope, the note pinned to her dress, the moment she had woken up at Ethan's ranch, certain she was about to die. And what happened then? The prosecutor asked. Ethan Cole cut me free. Mara's voice was clear and strong. He gave me water. He tended my wounds, and he told me that I wasn't property, that I never had been, that I was a human being with rights and dignity and worth. Did you believe him? Not at first. I'd been treated as cargo for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as a person. She paused, her eyes finding Ethan in the gallery. But he showed me, every day, in everything he did. He showed me that there were still good people in the world, people who would stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Rook's lawyers tried to discredit her, suggesting that her memory had been affected by trauma, that she had misidentified her captors, that she was seeking attention or revenge. But Mara remained unshakable, answering every question with quiet dignity. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The verdict came on December 23rd, just 2 days before the new year. Guilty on all counts: trafficking, kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy. The jury had deliberated for less than an hour. Rook showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He stood straight and still, his pale eyes fixed on some point beyond the courtroom walls. But as the bailiffs moved to take him away, he turned and looked directly at Ethan and Mara, who were sitting together in the gallery. "You think you've won," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "But men like me never really lose. There will always be someone willing to pay for what I sold. Always someone willing to look the other way." "Maybe," Ethan replied, rising to his feet. "But there will also always be people willing to fight you, people like us, and every time one of you falls, we grow stronger." Rook smiled, a cold and terrible thing. "We'll see about that." The bailiffs led him away, and Ethan sat back down, his heart pounding. Mara's hand found his and squeezed tight. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "This part is, but the work goes on." He turned to look at her, and despite everything, he smiled. Are you ready? I've never been more ready for anything in my life. They left Tucson the next morning, heading north toward the ranch that was no longer just a place of isolation and grief. Word had already spread about what they were building there, and 3 women were waiting for them when they arrived. Escaped survivors of other trafficking operations, women who had heard about the sanctuary and had nowhere else to go. Martha, the woman who had sheltered them in Silver Creek, had closed her boarding house and come to help. She took charge of the domestic arrangements with brisk efficiency, organizing bedrooms and meal schedules and chore rotations as if she'd been doing it all her life. "Someone has to keep things running while you two are off changing the world," she said with a wry smile. "Might as well be me." The winter was hard, as Arizona winters always were. Snow fell on the high pastures, and the wind howled down from the mountains with a ferocity that seemed determined to test their resolve. But the house was warm, and the fire was always burning, and slowly, day by day, the women who came to them began to heal. Ethan found himself transformed by the work. The isolation that had defined his life for so long, the walls he'd built around himself after Sarah's death, crumbled in the face of so much need. He discovered that he had a gift for listening, for sitting quietly while someone worked through their pain, for offering comfort without judgment or expectation. Mara was the heart of the operation. She organized educational programs, teaching the women skills they could use to support themselves, reading and writing for those who'd never learned, arithmetic, basic bookkeeping. She wrote letters to businesses across the territory, seeking employment opportunities for survivors who were ready to start new lives. And she testified at trial after trial as Rook's network was gradually dismantled and his associates were brought to justice. Spring came slowly, the snow retreating up the mountains like a tide going out. The days grew longer, the nights warmer, and the ranch began to bloom with new life. A garden took shape behind the house, vegetables and flowers growing side by side. A chicken coop appeared, then a small dairy cow, then a pair of goats that seemed determined to escape their pen at every opportunity. And through it all, Ethan and Mara grew closer. Not with the rush of new romance, but with the slow, steady deepening of 2 people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. They talked late into the night about their hopes and fears, their dreams for the future, the scars they both carried from their pasts. They argued sometimes about money, about priorities, about the best way to help the women in their care, but they always found their way back to each other. One evening in early May, Ethan found Mara standing at the fence where she had first arrived, looking out over the desert as the sun sank toward the horizon. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "I was just thinking about how different everything looks now." She gestured at the landscape, the same landscape she had first seen through eyes blurred by pain and fear. Back then, this place felt like the end of everything, the final stop on a journey to nowhere. And now? Now it feels like home. She turned to face him, and the setting sun painted her face in shades of gold. "I never thought I'd feel at home anywhere again. After what happened, I thought that part of me was broken forever. But you fixed it. This place fixed it." "You fixed yourself," Ethan corrected gently. "I just gave you space to do it." "Maybe." She smiled, and it was a smile he'd come to love. Not the guarded, careful smile of their early days, but something open and genuine and full of light. "But you gave me something else too, something I never expected to find." "What's that?" "Love." The word hung in the air between them, precious and fragile and true. "I love you, Ethan Cole. I didn't think I was capable of it anymore, but I do." Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a door opening that he'd thought was locked forever. "I love you too. I think I have since the moment I found you in that wagon." "That's a long time to wait to say it." "I wanted to be sure you were ready to hear it." Mara reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples. "I'm ready now. For everything. For whatever comes next." Ethan covered her hand with his own. "Marry me. For real this time. Not because you need protection, not because it's convenient, but because you want to. Because I want to. Because we belong together." "I thought we were already married." "On paper. But I want more than paper. He turned his head and kissed her palm. I want forever. Mara was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face. Then she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. Yes, she said simply. Forever sounds exactly right. They were married again in June, on the porch of the ranch house with Martha officiating and a crowd of survivors as witnesses. Mara wore a simple white dress that one of the women had made for her, and Ethan wore his best suit, which was neither particularly fine nor particularly well-fitting, but which he'd bought specifically for the occasion. Pearl came from San Francisco with Rose by her side, thin and pale but alive, her eyes gradually losing the haunted look that captivity had left behind. Marshall Harker made the trip from Tucson, along with Billy, the telegraph operator, and half a dozen others who had played their parts in bringing Rook to justice. By the power vested in me by absolutely no one, Martha announced, her eyes twinkling, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Again. For the last time. Hopefully. The crowd laughed, and Ethan kissed his bride, and somewhere above them a hawk circled lazily in the summer sky. Later, after the celebration had wound down and the guests had departed, Ethan and Mara stood together on the porch, watching the stars come out. The ranch was quiet now, peaceful in a way it had never been during the years Ethan had lived here alone. Happy? He asked. More than I ever thought possible. Mara leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. A year ago, I was cargo, a piece of freight shipped across the country to be used and discarded. And now I'm here, with you, building something that matters. It doesn't seem real sometimes. It's real. All of it. Ethan wrapped his arm around her. And it's just the beginning. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Pearl said something to me before she left. She said that what we're doing here, the sanctuary, the work with survivors, it's spreading. Other people in other places are starting similar programs. She thinks that within a few years there could be a whole network of refuges across the country. That's amazing. It is. But it wouldn't have happened without you. Without us. Mara turned to look at him. We started something here, Ethan. Something bigger than either of us. And it's going to keep growing long after we're gone. Then we'd better make sure we lay a good foundation. We already have. She kissed him softly. We already have. The years that followed were not always easy. There were setbacks and disappointments, survivors who couldn't be reached, battles that couldn't be won. Rook died in prison 3 years into his sentence, but his absence didn't end the trafficking networks he'd built. It only scattered them, making them harder to track and dismantle. But there were victories too. Women who came to the sanctuary broken and left it whole. Families reunited after years of separation. Laws changed, awareness raised, minds opened. The work continued day by day, life by life, and with each small triumph, the world became a little bit better. Ethan and Mara raised children together, 2 of their own, and 3 they adopted from among the survivors who came through their doors. The ranch grew and changed, buildings added and gardens expanded, until it bore little resemblance to the isolated homestead where Ethan had grieved alone for so many years. And through it all, they never forgot where they had started. The fence where Mara had been left like cargo still stood at the eastern boundary of the property, its posts weathered but strong. Every year, on the anniversary of her arrival, they walked out together to stand before it, remembering what had happened and marveling at how far they had come. Do you ever regret it? Mara asked one year, when their hair was gray and their steps slower than they once had been. Everything that happened, everything you gave up to help me? Ethan shook his head slowly. I didn't give up anything. I gained everything. He took her hand, the same hand he had held on so many nights, through so many trials. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting for my life to end. You showed me that there was still something worth living for. We showed each other. Mara squeezed his fingers. That's what love is, isn't it? 2 people, saving each other, over and over again. I think that's exactly what it is. They stood there in the golden afternoon light, 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Behind them, the ranch hummed with activity. children playing, survivors healing, the work of hope going on as it always did. And ahead of them, stretching out toward the horizon, the Arizona desert spread in all directions, wild and dangerous, and endlessly full of possibility, just like life itself, just like love. The sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Ethan and Mara turned and walked back toward the house, their hands still clasped, their hearts still full. They had chosen to stay, both of them. And in choosing, they had found something neither of them had expected to find. Not just safety, not just companionship, but a love that had survived the worst the world could offer and emerged stronger for it. The ranch stood quiet now, a beacon of hope in the Arizona wilderness. And in its walls, in its rooms, in the lives of everyone who had passed through its doors, a single truth echoed. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't fighting against darkness. It's choosing to build something bright in the middle of it. And sometimes the deepest love isn't born from romance or passion, but from two wounded souls who looked at each other and said, "You don't have to face this alone." Ethan Cole and Mara Hale had found that love. Against all odds, through all the danger and fear and uncertainty, they had found it, and they would hold on to it forever.